Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a glass of water, maybe just a quiet corner of the room where the light is low and the world outside can keep moving without asking too much from you for a while. Tonight we're going to New York City. Not the postcard version of it. Not the skyline glittering like a crown. Not Times Square buzzing with signs and taxis and tourists craning their necks toward towers of light. We're going to a different New York. A hotter New York. A poorer New York. A nervous New York. A city already sweating. Already arguing with itself. Already feeling as if one more bad thing might push it over the edge. And then, on a July night in 1977, the lights went out. Now, before we step into that darkness, I want you to think about something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late? Is your room quiet? Is there a lamp on beside you? Or the glow of a phone in your hand? Or some little electric number shining from an oven? A router? A clock? A charger? Something so ordinary you probably stopped noticing it years ago. And if every one of those lights went out in the next second, if the room around you suddenly became a shape instead of a place, if the windows went black, if the hallway disappeared, if the refrigerator fell silent and the air stopped moving, what would you feel first? Annoyance, maybe. Confusion. You might reach for your phone. You might laugh and say, well, that's inconvenient. But if you lived in New York City on the night of July 13th, 1977, you did not have a smartphone to reach for. You did not have a flashlight app. You did not have a text thread lighting up with updates. You had the city around you, and then suddenly you had the sound of the city realizing that something was wrong. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling into these long-forgotten corners of history where ordinary people suddenly find themselves inside extraordinary moments, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it. Do it when some small detail pulls you in, when the past stops feeling like a date in a textbook and starts feeling like a room you could walk into. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, whether it is a bedroom, a kitchen, a city apartment, a quiet town, or somewhere on the other side of the world from New York, leave it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. For now, dim the lights a little if you can, not all the way, just enough to remember that light is not nothing. Let the room soften around you. And let us go back to a Wednesday night in July, to a city that thought it understood darkness until darkness came for everyone at once. The first thing to understand is that New York did not go dark in silence. Cities almost never do anything in silence. Even before the blackout, the night had sound in it. Air conditioners rattled in apartment windows, straining against the heat. Fans hummed. Radios played in kitchens and barbershops and open bedroom windows. Televisions flickered blue against living room walls. Elevators carried people upward through old apartment buildings. Subway trains moved under the streets with their usual metallic scream. Refrigerators clicked on and off behind deli counters. Neon signs buzzed above bars, pizza places, theatres, liquor stores, pharmacies, hotels, diners and pawn shops. The city was not merely using electricity. It was breathing through it. And this is the thing that is so easy to forget now. By 1977, electricity had become so normal in New York that it felt less like a service and more like part of nature. The city was built upward and downward on the assumption that power would be there. Elevators would rise, pumps would move water, traffic lights would command intersections, subways would carry millions through tunnels, refrigerators would keep food from spoiling, switchboards would connect calls, hospital machines would keep breathing bodies alive, store gates would hold, police radios would work, fire alarms would ring. The whole modern city rested on a quiet promise that no one had to say out loud. The lights will stay on. That promise broke at 9:34 p.m. It did not begin there, not really. The failures had started earlier, up along the electrical system that fed the city, with lightning strikes and overloaded lines and decisions made in control rooms where men watched gauges and diagrams and tried to keep a wounded grid from collapsing. But for most New Yorkers, history did not begin with the lightning. It began with the room going black. One moment a television was speaking, and the next it was a dead grey box. One moment a fan was pushing warm air across a bedroom, and the next the air stopped. One moment a traffic light was red, green, yellow, doing its ordinary little job above an intersection, and the next it was just a dark metal shape hanging over cars that now had to negotiate the street by instinct and nerve. In apartment buildings, elevators froze between floors. In subway tunnels, trains stopped with passengers inside them, the cars suddenly hot and still beneath the city. In restaurants, conversations paused. In stores, cash registers died. In theatres, projectors stopped, and audiences sat for a second in the strange dark, waiting for someone to say whether this was part of the show. There is always that first second in a blackout, when the mind refuses to accept what has happened. You blink. You look toward the switch, as if the room itself has made a small mistake. You wait for the power to come back, because most of the time it does. A flicker, a hum, a short interruption, and then everyone laughs a little and returns to what they were doing. But this was not a flicker. This was New York City being unplugged from itself. Imagine standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan when it happened. The summer air was heavy, the kind of air that sits on the skin instead of moving past it. It had been hot, and the heat was not simply weather. It was mood. It had settled into brick walls, into stairwells, into subway platforms, into the backs of taxis, into the bodies of people who had spent the day working, waiting, sweating, and trying not to snap at one another. Then the lights above you vanished. The shop windows went dark. The office towers lost their sparkle floor by floor. The street lamps blinked out. The traffic lights died. And for a few seconds, the most famous city in America looked like something older, something wounded, something that had slipped backward in time so suddenly that the people inside it did not yet know how to behave. The skyline must have been one of the strangest sights in modern American history. New York was supposed to glow. That was part of its identity. It was the city that announced itself at night. Even people who had never been there understood it as light. Times Square signs, bridges illuminated against black water, office towers burning late with work, apartment windows stacked like hundreds of tiny private lives. But on that night, the skyline darkened into a silhouette. Buildings became shapes. Streets became corridors. The city did not disappear exactly. It became harder to read. That is what darkness does. It does not remove the world. It removes your confidence in the world. Inside apartments, people moved carefully. A mother opened a kitchen drawer and felt around for matches. Someone cursed because the flashlight batteries were dead. A child asked what happened, and an adult said, "Nothing, just the lights," though neither of them knew whether that was true. In some buildings, neighbours called through doors. In others, people stayed quiet and listened. The hallways in many apartment houses became tunnels of heat and uncertainty. Without elevator service, anyone above the first few floors had to decide whether to stay where they were or take the stairs by feel. Stairwells that were merely unpleasant in daylight became something else in darkness, especially in a city where people already worried about crime, about strangers, about the person they might meet between floors when no one could see clearly. In the subway, the darkness was more physical. It had weight. Thousands of people were trapped underground that night when the system lost power. Some trains sat in stations. Others stopped between stations, sealed inside tunnels where the air grew hotter and thinner with each passing minute. This subway was already a place of friction in 1977, a place marked by graffiti, delay, fear, and routine endurance. But a stalled train in a dark tunnel is different from an ordinary delay. There is no sky to look toward. There is no street corner to walk away from. You're inside the machinery of the city when the machinery stops being obedient. Passengers waited. Some were helped out and guided along tracks. Others sat in cars listening to voices in the dark, trying to remain calm while the heat gathered around them. And above ground, the streets began changing. Not all at once. That matters. The night did not instantly become chaos everywhere. In many places, people did what people often do in disasters. They helped. They directed traffic. They checked on neighbours. They brought out candles. They sat on stoops because apartments were too hot. They shared radios where battery radios still worked. They asked strangers what had happened. There were pockets of decency all over the city, small acts of order in a night that would later be remembered mostly for disorder. This is important because history has a way of flattening people. It turns a city into a headline. It turns millions of separate human beings into one word: panic, riot, blackout. But inside that word were people standing at intersections, waving cars through with their hands. People carrying groceries up dark staircases for elderly neighbours. People holding doors. People lighting candles. People trying to make the next 10 minutes understandable. Still, something else was moving too. To understand why the darkness became so dangerous in certain neighbourhoods, you have to understand that New York in 1977 was not a healthy city suddenly surprised by a power failure. It was a city already sick with many kinds of pressure. It had nearly gone bankrupt 2 years earlier. Services had been cut. Buildings had been abandoned. Fires had eaten through blocks of the Bronx and Brooklyn. Crime was high. Trust in government was low. The police were exhausted and often resented. The poor were angry, not in some vague emotional sense, but in the hard daily sense of people who had watched jobs leave, landlords disappear, schools struggle, streets decay, and politicians speak in phrases that did not fix anything. The blackout did not create that anger. It exposed it. That is one of the great misunderstandings about nights like this. People sometimes talk as if darkness itself caused the looting, as if the lights went out and ordinary life simply turned criminal because no one could see. But darkness is rarely the whole story. Darkness removes supervision. It removes routine. It removes the feeling that someone is in control. And when it falls on a place where frustration has been building for years, it can act like a door opening. In some neighbourhoods, that door opened quickly. Storefront gates were attacked. Windows shattered. People poured into shops, sometimes carrying away things of obvious value, sometimes things that seemed almost random in the frenzy of the moment. Televisions, radios, appliances, furniture, clothing, liquor, food, mattresses, shoes, cash registers, mannequins, anything that could be lifted, dragged, rolled, or thrown into a car. In parts of Brooklyn, people tied ropes or chains to metal security gates and used cars to pull them from storefronts. In the Bronx, in Harlem, in Crown Heights, in Bushwick, in sections already scarred by abandonment and fire, the night became something far larger than a power outage. It became a release of pressure that no one could control. Now, I want to be careful here, because this story is often told in a way that turns poor neighbourhoods into scenery for fear. That is too easy, and it is not honest enough. Looting happened, arson happened, violence happened, shop owners lost everything, firefighters were attacked in some places and overwhelmed in others, police were injured, families hid in apartments listening to glass break below them. That is real, and we should not soften it. But it is also true that the people living in those neighbourhoods were not all looters, not all criminals, not all part of the destruction. Many were victims of the blackout twice over, first when the electricity failed, and again when their own streets burned, when the stores they depended on were damaged, when the neighbourhoods already neglected by the city were left even more wounded by mourning. The night revealed rage, yes, but it also revealed abandonment. It showed what can happen when a city lets whole communities feel as though they are already living in the dark long before the power fails. There is a detail from that night that I keep coming back to because it captures something about modern life that is both ordinary and terrifying. When the lights went out, the city did not just become dark, it became disconnected. Think of all the invisible systems that depend on power. The elevator is not just convenience if you live on the 20th floor. The refrigerator is not just comfort if you own a small grocery store and all your stock is perishable. A traffic light is not just a coloured lamp. It is an agreement between strangers moving heavy machines through the same space. A subway signal is not just equipment. It is the difference between motion and paralysis. An alarm system is not just noise. It is a promise to a shopkeeper that locked doors might mean something. When electricity failed, thousands of these agreements failed with it. For a city as dense as New York, that mattered immediately. The darkness did not fall on empty fields. It fell on packed blocks, crowded buildings, busy avenues, tunnels, bridges, hospitals, airports, precinct houses, firehouses, stores, shelters, hotels, restaurants, and apartments where people had already spent the day enduring heat. The power failure turned ordinary vertical living into a problem. It turned transportation into a problem. It turned food storage into a problem. It turned policing into a problem. It turned the simple act of knowing what was happening into a problem. And yet, as frightening as the night became, there was something almost intimate about those first minutes inside homes. People who normally lived beside one another without speaking suddenly had to speak. Doors opened, candles appeared. Someone found a battery radio. Someone said it was just the block. Someone else said no, it was Manhattan. Then no, Brooklyn too. Then no, the whole city. Rumour travelled faster than official information because rumour does not need electricity. It moves mouth to mouth, window to window, stoop to stoop. In the absence of light, people began building explanations out of fragments. Was it terrorism? Was it sabotage? Was it another failure like 1965? Was it Con Edison? Was it the heat? Was the power coming back in 10 minutes? Would it be out all night? No one knew, and not knowing is its own kind of darkness. Picture a family in an apartment in Brooklyn. The television has gone dead. The father stands by the window, looking down at a street he can barely see. The mother lights a candle and tells the children not to touch it. One child is excited because a blackout can feel like an adventure for exactly 5 minutes. Another is scared because the hallway outside is too quiet and too loud at the same time. Somewhere below, a car horn sounds, then another. Someone yells, a dog barks. The air in the apartment gets warmer now that the fan has stopped. The refrigerator is opened once, quickly, then closed again because every adult understands without needing to say it that cold air is now something to save. A neighbour knocks and asks if they have matches. The mother gives her 2. The small flame moves down the hallway in another person's hand. That is the version of the blackout that rarely survives in photographs. Cameras prefer broken glass and burning stores because those images explain themselves quickly. But millions of people experience the blackout not as a riot, not as a symbol, not as a political event, but as a long night in a hot room where the ordinary tools of life no longer worked. They sat on beds. They leaned out windows. They listened. They waited for the lights to return with the particular impatience of people who had never considered that the lights might not return soon. The city itself seemed to hold its breath and shout at the same time. Police radios crackled. Fire companies began moving from call to call. Dispatchers tried to understand where help was needed most. Sirens cut through neighbourhoods that were otherwise losing their normal electric hum. In some streets, the sirens were the only proof that the city still had a nervous system. Firefighters drove towards smoke they could see rising against the darker sky. Police officers arrived at stores already opened by crowds. Some were badly outnumbered. Some made arrests. Some tried to move people along. Some could do little more than watch one emergency while another appeared 2 blocks away. And over all of it was the heat. Never forget the heat. Cold darkness is one thing. Hot darkness is another. In winter, darkness pushes people inward toward blankets, coats, and fire. In summer, darkness traps the body inside itself. Without fans, without air conditioning, without open stores and illuminated streets offering some sense of movement, the heat became intimate and irritating. It made tempers shorter. It made sleep harder. It made crowded spaces more unbearable. The blackout did not happen on a cool, quiet night when people could simply go to bed and wait. It happened in the kind of weather that already makes a city feel personal, when every smell sharpens, every noise feels closer, every delay feels like an insult. New York had seen a blackout before. In 1965, a much larger power failure had affected a huge part of the Northeast, and the memory of that night still lingered in the city. People had told stories about strangers helping strangers, about calm, about a kind of civic grace under darkness. But 1977 was not 1965. The city had changed. The economy had changed. The mood had changed. The blackout of 1965 had become almost sentimental in memory, a night when the city discovered its better angels. The blackout of 1977 would not be remembered that way. It would be remembered as a night when the city looked at itself in the dark and did not entirely like what it saw. Here is the thing I want you to really sit with for a moment. A blackout is one of the rare disasters that changes almost nothing physically at first. The buildings are still standing, the streets are still there, the bridges have not fallen, the rivers have not risen, the sky has not opened. And yet everything feels altered because the invisible support has vanished. You are still in the same room, but it is not the same room. You are still on the same street, but it is not the same street. The people around you are the same people, but now everyone is wondering what rules still apply. That is why blackouts are so unsettling. They reveal how much of civilization depends not only on laws or walls or police, but on expectation. We expect the switch to work. We expect the street to be lit. We expect the elevator to come. We expect the train to move. We expect the city to continue. And when it does not, even for one night, the mind begins asking questions it usually keeps buried. By late evening, the blackout had become the only story in New York because it had entered every kind of life at once. Wealthy people in high apartments found themselves carrying candles through rooms with expensive furniture. Working families sat on stoops because their apartments were too hot. Shopkeepers stood in front of stores, some armed, some pleading, some simply watching years of labour disappear through broken windows. Teenagers ran through streets that suddenly felt ungoverned. Taxi drivers crept through intersections without signals. Hospital staff worked under emergency procedures. People trapped in elevators waited for rescue and tried not to think too much about the air. In hotels, guests found that modern conveniences could become traps when electricity failed. In the subway, people learned how long a tunnel can feel when a train is no longer a train but a metal room under the earth. The darkness made the city strangely equal for a moment, and then deeply unequal the next. Everyone lost the lights. Not everyone lost the same amount. Some people had doormen, generators, candles, safe lobbies, working telephones, friends nearby, money enough to leave later if they needed to. Others had locked stairwells, failing neighbourhoods, no air conditioning, no reliable emergency help, and stores below them that might be burning before dawn. Disaster often pretends to be universal at first glance. It touches everyone, so we say everyone was affected. But the truth is always more exact than that. The same darkness fell everywhere, but it landed differently depending on where you lived, what you owned, who was responsible for you, and whether the city had been listening to your neighbourhood before the lights went out. I think that is why the 1977 blackout still matters. Not because New York went dark, cities go dark, systems fail, storms happen, wires fall, machines break. What makes this night worth remembering is what the darkness showed. It showed the fragility of a modern city built on invisible power. It showed the anger sitting beneath the surface of neighbourhoods that had been asked to survive too much with too little. It showed the courage of people who helped when no one was watching. It showed the fear of those who heard crowds outside and had no way to know if help would come. It showed a city exhausted by crisis and still somehow alive enough to stumble through one more night. Near midnight, the city was fully inside the event. There was no pretending anymore that this was a brief interruption. The lights were not coming back quickly. The night would be long. Fires were burning. Police precincts were filling. Storefronts were open to the street. Families were sleeping badly, or not sleeping at all. Subway passengers were still being moved. People stood on rooftops and looked over a skyline that no longer behaved like New York. And somewhere in the machinery of the power system, workers were trying to understand how to bring back a city that had gone down piece by piece and would not be restored by simply flipping one grand switch. Because the moment itself, the famous moment when the lights went out, was only the visible break. The real story had been building before that, in the heat, in the politics, in the finances, in the neighbourhoods, in the electrical grid, in the years of strain that made New York so vulnerable to one bad night. To understand why the darkness hit the way it did, we have to step backward from 9:34 p.m. and look at the city before the blackout, before the lightning, before the broken glass and sirens, when New York was still lit but already living close to the edge. To understand why the night of July 13th, 1977, became more than a power failure, you have to see New York before the lights went out, not the clean skyline on travel posters, not the city of bright marquees and yellow taxis moving beautifully through rain, not the New York people talk about when they want to describe ambition, glamour, money and speed. You have to see the city as it was that summer, tired in a way cities can become tired, carrying too much at once, like a person walking home with grocery bags cutting into both hands and no one opening the door. New York in 1977 was still enormous, still loud, still alive, still full of music, work, argument, invention, and people who loved it fiercely even when they complained about it all day. That is important. It was not a dead city. It was not a simple ruin. It was not one of those easy before and after stories where everything was good, then everything broke. New York was more complicated than that. It was a city where expensive restaurants served dinner, while only a few miles away entire blocks stood burned out. It was a city where Wall Street still moved money through the world, while local governments struggled to pay bills. It was a city where artists, musicians, immigrants, hustlers, secretaries, cops, nurses, teachers, landlords, tenants, shopkeepers and teenagers all occupied the same crowded island and outer boroughs, but not the same reality. Some people experienced New York as possibility, others experienced it as abandonment. Most experienced both in the same week, and that is what made the blackout so dangerous before it even happened. The electricity failed on one night, but the city had been losing power in other ways for years. Only 2 years earlier, New York had come frighteningly close to bankruptcy. That is one of those phrases that gets repeated so often it can lose its force, so let us slow down and actually picture what it meant. A city the size of New York, a city of millions, a city with schools, hospitals, bridges, police stations, firehouses, garbage trucks, subway lines, public housing, welfare offices, courtrooms, libraries, parks and payrolls, had reached the point where it could no longer easily borrow the money it needed to keep operating. Banks that had once been willing to buy city bonds began backing away. Investors stopped trusting that the city could pay them back. The government had been borrowing for years to cover ordinary expenses, pushing the problem forward, and by 1975 there was almost nowhere left to push it. That kind of crisis sounds financial on paper. Bonds, notes, credit ratings, emergency boards, budget gaps, words that feel clean and bloodless. But on the street, a financial crisis becomes something very physical. It becomes fewer workers collecting garbage. It becomes a firehouse closing. It becomes a school with fewer adults in the building. It becomes a subway station where repairs are delayed again and again until decay feels permanent. It becomes a police department asked to do more with less. It becomes an apartment building where the landlord has stopped caring, because the neighbourhood no longer seems worth the investment. It becomes people waiting longer for help and slowly, over time, expecting less from the city that once promised so much. In 1975, thousands of municipal workers faced layoffs. Police officers, firefighters, teachers, sanitation workers, hospital workers, clerks, people whose jobs were not abstract government positions but the daily muscles of the city. Some lost their jobs, others kept them but felt the warning in their bones. The famous newspaper headline telling the city, in effect, that Washington would not rescue it became part of the emotional weather of New York. People argued over whether the city had been reckless, whether the federal government was cruel, whether unions had asked for too much, whether politicians had lied, whether the poor were being blamed, whether the middle class was leaving, whether the whole place had become ungovernable. These were not polite debates happening far away. They were conversations in kitchens, union halls, bars, break rooms, taxis, schools, and precinct houses. The city survived the fiscal crisis, but survival is not the same as recovery. New York did not simply wake up after 1975 healthy again. It woke up poorer, watched, disciplined, and suspicious. Outside financial overseers had more power over its budget. Cuts had already done damage. Trust had been weakened, and trust, once it thins out in a city, is not easy to rebuild. People began to wonder whether the systems around them would be there when needed. Would the fire department come quickly? Would the police come at all? Would the school stay open? Would the subway run? Would the garbage be picked up? Would a neighbourhood be protected or quietly written off? By the summer of 1977, these questions were not theoretical. You could see the strain most clearly in neighbourhoods that had been losing people, money, and official attention for years. Parts of the South Bronx had become symbols of urban collapse, but that phrase, urban collapse, is too tidy. It hides the lived reality. It means buildings abandoned by owners who no longer saw profit in maintaining them. It means families living beside vacant lots filled with rubble and trash. It means children walking past burned structures on their way to school, as if ruins were normal scenery. It means tenants stuck in buildings where heat failed, locks broke, plaster cracked, and stairwells smelled of urine, smoke, and damp concrete. It means landlords sometimes collecting what they could and repairing almost nothing. It means fire, not as a rare emergency, but as a repeated fact of neighbourhood life. The fires were not all the same. Some came from neglect, faulty wiring, broken heating systems, candles, cigarettes, or ordinary accidents made worse by deteriorating buildings. Some were arson. Some were tied to insurance fraud. Some came from desperation. However they began, the result was visible from block to block. A building burned. People left. The shell remained. Another building nearby lost tenants. Stores closed. Services declined. A street that had once been crowded with ordinary life began to look like a place the city had stopped expecting to save. And when residents in those neighbourhoods saw more abandonment than repair, more policing than investment, more promises than proof, it changed their relationship with the city. They were not outside New York's crisis. They were living inside the part of it that photographers love to capture and officials preferred to explain away. This mattered on the night of the blackout because darkness does not fall on maps. It falls on conditions. A power outage in a stable neighbourhood might produce inconvenience. Neighbourly help may be theft at the edges. A power outage in a neighbourhood that already feels stripped and ignored can produce something more volatile. Not because people there are different in some simple, moral sense, but because the normal restraints of daily life are tied to belief. You have to believe that rules mean something. You have to believe that waiting your turn will lead somewhere. You have to believe that a store window separates private property from public hunger, in a society that will also give you a legal path to dignity. When those beliefs weaken, a dark street can become a place where old anger finds an opening. The city's crime problem was another part of the mood. In the 1970s, New York had a reputation for danger that was not invented out of nothing. Robberies, burglaries, assaults, and murders were part of the public conversation in a way that shaped how people moved through the city. Families warned children not to linger. Subway riders watched doors and platforms carefully. Women held keys between their fingers walking home. Store owners installed gates and locks and metal shutters. Apartment residents listened before opening doors. People developed small habits of caution that became so ordinary they barely noticed them anymore. They knew which blocks to avoid, which entrances felt wrong, which train cars looked safer, which strangers to ignore, when to keep walking. And then there was the fear of the son of Sam. By July 1977, New York was deep inside that panic. For a year, a killer had been attacking people, often young women or couples sitting in parked cars, leaving behind not only victims but a strange, spreading dread. The newspapers covered the case relentlessly. The name itself, Son of Sam, sounded like something from a bad dream, a phrase that made the city feel haunted by one of its own shadows. Women with long dark hair were especially frightened because early descriptions and rumours made them feel targeted. Some cut their hair, others dyed it. Couples avoided parked cars. Parents warned daughters. The police were under enormous pressure. Every new attack seemed to tell New Yorkers that even the private spaces of the city, a car, a sidewalk, a late ride home, could be violated without warning. Think about what that does to a summer night. It changes the meaning of darkness before the blackout even arrives. Darkness is no longer only the absence of light. It becomes a cover for danger. A doorway becomes a possible hiding place. A parked car becomes a risk. A stranger looking too long becomes a story you will tell someone later. In a calmer city, a blackout might have felt like an adventure at first, an interruption, something to laugh about from stoops and windows. In New York that July, darkness already had a reputation. The heat made everything worse. Summer in New York can be hard even in good times, and 1977 was not a good time. Heat collects in pavement and brick. It rises from subway grates. It hangs in apartments where windows open to other windows and air shafts instead of real breeze. It makes stairwells smell stronger and tempers shorter. It turns crowded trains into metal boxes of sweat and irritation. It makes small arguments grow faster. A city in heat is a city with less patience. People sit outside later because inside is too hot. Children stay on streets because apartments feel airless. Radios play through open windows. Hydrants are opened. Men gather on corners. Women lean from fire escapes. Everyone is closer to everyone else, whether they want to be or not. Electricity was the thing that made that heat bearable for those who had enough of it. Fans mattered. Air conditioners mattered. Refrigerators mattered. Ice mattered. Elevators mattered when old people lived high above the street. The modern summer city depends on power not only for convenience, but for tolerance. The fan in the window is not just a machine. It is the difference between sleeping and lying awake angry at the ceiling. The refrigerator is not just an appliance. It is food security for a family that cannot afford to replace spoiled groceries. The elevator is not just a box that moves. It is independence for someone whose knees cannot handle 10 flights. The blackout did not take away luxuries evenly. It took away fragile arrangements that many people were using to get through another hot night. New York's infrastructure already felt worn down. The subway, which had once stood as a symbol of urban efficiency, had become for many riders a daily lesson in endurance. Trains were often dirty, delayed, covered in graffiti, and hot. Crime on the system shaped public fear. Cars rattled through tunnels with straps, metal poles, scratched windows, dim lights, and the sense that everyone was just trying to get where they needed to go without incident. Graffiti covered trains so completely that some cars looked less like public transportation than moving walls of names, anger, art and defiance. To some people it was vandalism and proof that order had failed. To others, especially young people with few other ways to be seen, it was expression in a city that otherwise ignored them. Either way, the subway carried the argument on its skin. Above ground, the streets had their own signs of fatigue. Some neighbourhoods were full of life. Music from record shops, kids playing, old men talking, women carrying groceries, vendors working, churches open, people doing what people do, because life continues even when a city is in trouble. But many commercial strips were guarded by metal gates and heavy locks. Shopkeepers worried about theft even with lights on. Insurance was expensive or difficult. Margins were thin. A broken window could ruin a small business. A stolen inventory could end years of work. Many stores in poorer neighbourhoods were owned by people who lived somewhere else, but many were also family businesses where the person behind the counter knew the customers by name and still slept badly because one bad night could take everything. The relationship between police and many communities was tense. Officers were asked to confront crime in neighbourhoods where they were often distrusted. Residents wanted protection, but also resented rough treatment, slow responses, and the feeling that police arrived as an occupying force rather than a public service. In some areas, people had seen too much crime to romanticize disorder, but they had also seen enough official failure to doubt authority. That contradiction sat heavily over the city. People could be afraid of criminals and angry at the police at the same time. They could want more safety and less harassment. They could call for help and still not trust the people who came. Cities are full of contradictions like that, and in a crisis those contradictions do not politely step aside. They come into the street. There was also a generational pressure building. Young people in many neighbourhoods were coming of age in a city that offered them fewer clear routes forward. Manufacturing jobs had been leaving. Factories that once employed working-class New Yorkers were closing or shrinking. The old promise that a person could leave school, find work, support a family, and build a modest, stable life was weakening. For teenagers and young adults in poor neighbourhoods, the future could feel narrow. Schools were strained, jobs were scarce. The streets were full of signals that the official economy did not have much room for them. Some found music, cruise, style, street life, dance, graffiti, hustle, politics or crime. Some simply waited. Some worked hard and still felt stuck. Some watched television commercials showing a country of abundance, and then walked outside into blocks where abundance existed only behind glass. That glass mattered. Store windows in New York did more than display goods. They displayed distance, televisions, stereos, shoes, clothes, furniture, appliances, things shown under bright lights to people who often could not buy them. Consumer America in the 1970s was loud. It promised identity through things. It told people what kind of person they could become with the right sound system, the right jacket, the right pair of sneakers, the right living room set, the right record player, the right television. And in a city with deep inequality, those promises sat in windows, guarded by locks. Most nights, the locks held not just because of police, but because daylight, routine, consequence, and social order held. On the night of the blackout in some places, those locks suddenly looked less permanent. But before we arrive there, stay with the city while it is still lit. Because the most important part of this section of the story is that the blackout did not happen to a blank city. It happened to a place already telling itself many different stories about what it was becoming. One New York was still creative, almost beyond belief. In 1977, disco was alive in clubs where people dressed carefully and danced as if the world outside could be suspended until morning. Punk was tearing through downtown spaces with a rawness that matched the city's broken edges. Hip-hop was growing in the Bronx at parties, in parks, in community rooms, on borrowed equipment, using turntables and records to build something new out of what was available. Artists lived in lofts in neighbourhoods that still felt industrial and cheap enough to risk a life in. Writers, photographers, Musicians, dancers, and outsiders of every kind found in New York a place rough enough to hurt them and open enough to let them exist. The same city that looked like failure to some observers was, for others, producing culture that would reshape the world. That is one reason the story of New York in the 1970s cannot be told only as decay. Decay was real. Fear was real. Poverty was real. But so was invention. People make things in broken places. Sometimes they make them because the place is broken, because official structures have failed and space opens for improvisation. A blackout in a city like that did not fall on passivity. It fell on energy, frustration, creativity, hunger, anger, humour, pride, and exhaustion all crowded together on the same streets. The newspapers fed and reflected the mood. New York has always been a newspaper city, a place where headlines are written not merely to inform but to punch. The tabloids gave people fear, outrage, comedy, scandal, crime, politics, sports, and neighbourhood gossip in language sharp enough to carry under one arm on the subway. In 1977, the papers were full of the fiscal crisis, crime, Son of Sam, politics, labour problems, and all the evidence that the city was having trouble governing itself. Every morning, New Yorkers could read about their own anxiety in black ink. Every evening, television news showed the same city back to them through fires, arrests, press conferences, and interviews with people who had reached the end of patience. City Hall was under pressure too. Mayor Abraham Beame, who had taken office with hopes of steadiness, had become closely associated with the fiscal crisis. Many New Yorkers saw him as overwhelmed by events, whether fairly or unfairly. The city was preparing for an election, and Ed Koch, Mario Cuomo, Bella Abzug and others were part of a political season that reflected just how unsettled New York had become. What kind of leader did the city need? A manager? A fighter? A reformer? A neighbourhood voice? Someone to calm the banks? Someone to restore services? Someone to make people feel safe again? The debate was really about what kind of city New York still believed it could be. The blackout came in the middle of that question. That is why it landed so heavily. It seemed to many like proof. Proof that the city was failing. Proof that the government could not protect basic systems. Proof that poor neighbourhoods were angry. Proof that police were outnumbered. Proof that the old New York was gone. Proof of whatever a person already feared. Events like this become mirrors very quickly. People look at the same night and see different truths. A wealthy resident looking out from a darkened apartment might have seen disorder below and thought the city had become unlivable. A shopkeeper watching people attack a gate might have seen the destruction of a lifetime's work. A teenager in a neighbourhood full of abandoned buildings might have seen, for a few wild hours, a world where the usual barriers had fallen. A firefighter rushing toward another burning building might have seen exhaustion and danger. A mother keeping children away from the window might have seen only the need to survive the night quietly. A city official might have seen a catastrophe to be explained by equipment failure and emergency response. A historian looking back has to see all of them, not because all actions are equal, but because the city was never one person's experience. There is another detail worth holding on to. New York had not forgotten the blackout of 1965. That earlier outage had affected a large part of the Northeast and left millions without power. But in public memory, especially in New York, it became almost a story of civic good behaviour. People helped one another. Traffic moved with improvised courtesy. Crime did not explode in the way many feared. 9 months later, newspapers joked about a baby boom, even if the reality was more complicated than the joke. The 1965 blackout entered memory as proof that modern people, when faced with sudden darkness, might become neighbourly. By 1977, that memory was almost cruel. It gave the city a comparison it could not live up to. If the lights went out in 1965 and people behaved, What did it mean if they went out in 1977 and parts of the city erupted? Had New Yorkers changed? Had the city changed? Had the conditions changed? The answer, of course, was yes to all of it, but not in the simple moral way people wanted. The city of 1977 had endured a decade of strain that the city of 1965 had not yet known. The blackout did not reveal that people had suddenly become worse. It revealed that the social ground beneath them had shifted. And still, on the evening of July 13th, before the first failures cascaded through the grid, millions of people were simply living. That ordinariness is important because history often begins after the disaster, with a dramatic moment. The lightning strike, the outage, the sirens, the broken glass. But every disaster interrupts ordinary life. That is part of its power. People are cooking dinner late, washing dishes, watching television, working night shifts, riding home, opening stores, closing stores, drinking in bars, going to movies, sitting in traffic, talking on phones, bathing children, arguing with spouses, listening to music, making plans for the next day. Someone was getting dressed to go out. Someone was lying on a bed in front of a fan, too hot to move. Someone was carrying groceries up the stairs. Someone was waiting for a train. Someone was counting the register in a small shop. Someone was telling a child to stop leaning out the window. Someone was looking at the sky and noticing the weather, but not thinking it would become part of history. The storm was moving through the region. Lightning was striking. Electrical systems were carrying heavy summer demand. Control rooms were monitoring lines, loads, failures and alarms. But at the level of the street, New York did not feel like a grid. It felt like a city. That is how modern systems hide from us. We do not experience the power plant when we turn on a lamp. We do not experience transmission lines when we open a refrigerator. We do not experience substations when we ride an elevator. We experience only the result, and because the result is usually reliable, we mistake it for permanence. In 1977, New York was depending on a complicated electrical network at the very moment when the city itself was depending on a complicated social network that had already been weakened. Both systems required balance, both required maintenance, both required trust. Both could absorb stress only up to a point. When a line failed, another could carry the load for a while. When a neighbourhood lost jobs, families could absorb the strain for a while. When a budget was cut, workers could do more with less for a while. When fear increased, people could adjust their routines for a while. But for a while is not forever. Systems that look stable from a distance can be much closer to failure than anyone wants to admit. That is the feeling that hangs over New York before the blackout. Not doom, exactly. People do not live their daily lives inside a narrator's warning. They do not wake up and say, "Tonight history will arrive." They go to work, they sweat, they complain, they laugh, they buy milk. They catch trains, they read headlines. They adapt to decline so gradually that yesterday's emergency becomes today's background. But beneath the normal movement of the city, there was a brittleness. Too many people were tired. Too many neighbourhoods had been neglected. Too many institutions were distrusted. Too many systems were being asked to perform without enough margin for error. And then the sky above the city began doing what summer skies do. Clouds gathered. Thunder moved. Lightning found metal, towers, lines, and weak points in a system most New Yorkers never thought about. Somewhere far from the crowded streets, the first technical failures began. Not dramatic to the people watching instruments, perhaps not at first. A line here, a relay there, a load shifting somewhere else. The kind of problem that trained operators were supposed to contain before the public ever noticed. But the grid, like the city, was already carrying too much. So before we watch the lights go out, before we hear the first stalled subway train, before we stand in front of a shop window as the street changes around it, before we follow families into dark stairwells and firefighters toward burning blocks, We have to keep this version of New York in mind. A city still bright on the surface, but strained underneath. A city full of people who had learned to expect trouble and keep moving anyway. A city where wealth and abandonment existed close enough to see each other. A city where heat, fear, debt, crime, music, anger, humour, and stubborn love all lived side by side. The blackout did not create that city. It entered it. And when the power system finally began to fail, it did not fail into emptiness. It failed into a city already waiting, though no one would have put it that way, for one more thing to go wrong. The sky over New York that evening did not look like a machine failing. That is one of the strange things about disasters in a modern city. From the sidewalk, from the window, from the seat of a bus, they rarely announce themselves in the language of the systems that will actually break. A person looking up on July 13th, 1977, would have seen summer weather. Thunderclouds, heat, the heavy look of an evening storm moving through the region after a day that had already taken patience from everyone. Maybe there was lightning in the distance, bright for a second and gone before the mind could make much of it. Maybe someone in an apartment glanced out and thought, good, maybe rain will cool the air. Maybe someone else cursed because a storm meant traffic, wet shoes, delays, and another miserable ride home. Almost no one looked at that sky and thought about transmission lines, relays, substations, load, voltage, reserve generation, and the fragile balance that kept the city alive. That is how electricity hides from us, It does its work so completely that we stop imagining the work at all. The lamp comes on, so somewhere the system is functioning. The train moves, so somewhere the system is functioning. The elevator rises, so somewhere the system is functioning. The refrigerator hums, the traffic light changes, the phone rings, the radio plays, and because each small thing works, the mind accepts the whole great arrangement as solid. But the electrical grid is not solid in the way a bridge is solid or a brick wall is solid. It is a living balance of supply and demand, generation and transmission, protection and response. It is always adjusting. It is always correcting. It is always trying to keep millions of separate actions from becoming one large problem. On most nights, it succeeds so quietly that no one thanks it. On this night, it began to fail in a place most New Yorkers had never heard of. The name was Buchanan South. It was not a place people in Brooklyn or Queens or Manhattan would have thought about while making dinner or waiting for a train. It sat up along the Hudson River, part of the electrical world outside the ordinary mental map of the city. To most people, electricity came from Con Edison, and Con Edison was a bill, a logo, a truck in the street, a complaint when the rates went up, a number to call when something stopped working. But behind that simple public face was an enormous network of power plants, substations, transmission lines, switching equipment, and operators trying to move electricity from where it was produced to where it was needed. New York City, despite its size and confidence, did not simply make all the power it used inside its own borders. It depended on power flowing in from outside, carried over high-voltage lines that most people noticed only as towers along highways or metal shapes in the distance. High-voltage electricity is moved that way because distance matters. You cannot send huge amounts of power efficiently through ordinary neighbourhood wires. So the system raises electricity to very high voltages, sends it across long transmission lines, and then lowers it again at substations so it can be distributed through the city. It is a practical arrangement, but it also means that a city of millions can depend on equipment far from the streets where those millions live. A storm up the Hudson can become a dark apartment in the Bronx. A stuck breaker can become a stalled train under Manhattan. A line tripping out of service can become a shopkeeper, standing in front of a dead cash register and wondering why the city suddenly sounds wrong. A little after 8:30 that evening, lightning struck. Now, lightning by itself was not supposed to be enough to destroy the city's power. That is important. Electrical systems are designed with the knowledge that storms happen. Lightning hits lines. Equipment trips. Breakers open. Protective devices do what they are built to do, which is to isolate trouble before it spreads. A grid is not expected to be delicate like glass. It is expected to absorb shocks. That is why there are circuit breakers in the first place. They are not unlike the breakers in a home, though on a scale that makes the comparison almost comically small. When there is a dangerous surge or fault, the breaker opens to stop damage. Then, under the right conditions, it can close again and allow power to keep flowing. The system is supposed to protect itself and recover, but protection only works when the pieces behave as expected. On that evening, at Buchanan South, 2 circuit breakers tripped after lightning hit. One of the breakers did not reclose properly. A small mechanical problem, the kind of thing that sounds almost insulting when placed beside the size of what followed, helped keep a major path of power from returning to service. There is something unsettling about that. We want large disasters to have large causes. We want them to feel proportionate. A city goes dark, so the cause should look like a bomb, an earthquake, a deliberate attack, some grand failure equal to the result. But modern systems do not always break that way. Sometimes a vast chain of dependence meets a loose part, a delayed response, a bad reading, a missed chance, and then the scale grows afterward. That is one of the most important truths of the 1977 blackout. It was not one thing. It was not simply lightning. It was not simply Con Edison. It was not simply operator error. It was not simply old equipment. It was not simply the weather, or the heat, or the demand, or the design of the system. It was the way these things met. Natural events, mechanical trouble, system design, and human decision-making formed a sequence. Each problem pushed stress onto another part of the grid. Each minute mattered. Each protective action that did not work cleanly left the next operator facing a narrower set of choices. Imagine a crowded dinner table where one person gets up suddenly and hands their full plate to the person beside them. That person can hold 2 plates for a while. Then another person gets up and hands over another. Soon the person holding the plates is trying not to spill anything, arms shaking, while the rest of the table keeps passing things along as if this can continue forever. That's not a perfect explanation of an electrical grid, but it gives you the feeling of it. When one major line goes out, power does not simply vanish neatly from the system. It shifts. It moves over remaining lines. Those lines now carry more. If more equipment trips, still more load is pushed elsewhere. The system can become overloaded not because all power is gone, but because the power is trying to travel through too few safe paths. After the first strike, the system was wounded but not dead. Operators still had time. That is another detail that makes this story so tense when you slow it down. The blackout was not instantaneous. It unfolded. There were warnings. There were attempts to respond. There were men in control rooms watching the conditions change, trying to bring generation online, trying to reduce strain, trying to keep the city from going under. The people responsible for the grid were not sitting casually while disaster approached. They understood that something serious was happening, but knowing a problem is serious is not the same as having enough time, enough power, enough clear information, and enough flexible equipment to solve it. A second lightning strike made the situation worse. More high-voltage lines were lost or partly disabled. Power from Indian Point, one of the major sources feeding the system, became harder to move into the city. Other lines began carrying loads they were not meant to carry for long. The system was still trying to balance itself, but the balance was becoming more difficult by the minute. In a city apartment, nothing had changed yet. A woman could still be washing dishes under kitchen light. A man could still be watching television. A teenager could still be listening to music, annoyed by the heat, and unaware that the city's electrical life was now being negotiated in numbers and alarms far away. This is the part of the story that always feels almost unfair. People on the street had no way to know they were living through the last ordinary hour before the blackout. That last hour had all the texture of normal life. Elevators still worked. which meant people stepped into them without fear. Subway trains still moved, which meant passengers entered tunnels without imagining they might have to be led out along the tracks. Store owners still trusted the lights above their counters, restaurants still cooked, bars still poured drinks. Hospital staff still worked with emergency procedures somewhere in the background, but not yet at the centre of everything. People used electricity right up to the moment electricity stopped using them. Inside the control rooms, the situation was becoming harder to contain. Con Edison tried to bring additional generation online. That phrase sounds simple, but a power plant is not a lamp. You do not just switch it on and instantly replace hundreds of megawatts moving through damaged lines. Some units can start faster than others, but everything still has timing, limits, operating conditions, and physical reality. A generator must be synchronized. Equipment must be ready. Power has to enter a system that is already unstable without making that instability worse. Operators had procedures, but procedures are written for possible worlds, and real emergencies often arrive as a slightly different world than the one the procedure imagined. The demand that evening was high because it was summer and people were using cooling equipment. Air conditioners and fans all over the city were not dramatic, but together they mattered. Every apartment trying to push heat out of a room was part of the load. Every store keeping lights on and refrigerators cold was part of the load. Every subway train, elevator, pump, sign, office, restaurant, theatre, hospital wing and street lamp belonged to the same appetite. The city was hungry for power, and the supply paths feeding that hunger were being damaged. Now, here is something I want you to think about. Electricity must be generated and consumed in balance almost moment by moment. It is not stored in the grid like water in a tank waiting politely for later. The power system has to maintain frequency and voltage within usable limits. If generation falls too far behind demand, or if transmission paths cannot carry what is needed, the system begins to misbehave. Machines protect themselves. Relays operate. Generators trip. Lines disconnect. The very devices designed to prevent damage can, in a cascading failure, help deepen the separation between supply and demand. They are not doing the wrong thing from their own point of view. A generator that sees dangerous conditions shuts down to avoid destroying itself. A protective relay that detects what looks like a fault acts. Each piece tries to survive. The city, however, needs the whole system to survive together. That is the frightening intelligence of a cascade. No single part thinks it is collapsing a city. Each part responds to immediate danger. A line opens, another line overloads, a generator trips, voltage drops, more protection acts, operators attempt to shed load or stabilize flow. But the timing tightens. The system becomes less forgiving. What had been an engineering problem becomes a race, and this race was happening in the dark before the city itself went dark. At the big Ravenswood generating station in Queens stood a unit known by a name New Yorkers could almost appreciate, even if they knew nothing about power engineering: Big Alice. It was one of the largest generators serving the city, a huge machine with a name that sounded like it belonged to an industrial age folk tale. Big Alice was not some minor piece of equipment hidden in the corner of the system. It mattered. When the grid was under stress, losing such a generator would be a serious blow. And as conditions worsened that night, the system began producing electrical effects that protective equipment interpreted as dangerous. The buried transmission cables in New York had characteristics that made the automatic load-shedding process complicated. When parts of customer load were dropped, the electrical behaviour could look to generation equipment like a short or fault. Protection systems are built to act quickly in those situations because hesitation can ruin machinery. So the machine protected itself. When Big Alice tripped, the city's chances narrowed sharply. There is a particular kind of helplessness in a system failure that happens too fast for ordinary people and too slowly for the people watching it. To the public, the blackout would seem sudden. To the operators, It was a sequence with minutes and decisions inside it. They could see it happening and still not be able to stop it. That may be the most painful position in any disaster. Close enough to understand the danger, not powerful enough to reverse it. Let us stay with that for a moment. Somewhere, a man is looking at instruments and knowing the city is slipping. He may not be thinking in dramatic sentences. People at work in emergencies rarely do. He's thinking in terms of load, voltage, units, breakers, calls, instructions, alarms, what can be started, what must be disconnected, what procedure says, what the system is actually doing. He is hearing voices, maybe calm, maybe strained. He is aware of the clock, not as a thing on the wall, but as pressure. Every minute lost changes the next minute. The city outside is still lit, but in the room where the grid is being watched, the future is already dimming. This is where the 1977 blackout becomes almost intimate in a strange way. It was not caused by a crowd. It was not caused by looters. It was not caused by the neighbourhoods that would later be blamed for what happened after the lights went out. The first failure was technical, distant, and largely invisible. Before a single window broke, before a single store gate came down, before a single fire was set, the city had already been made vulnerable by wires, breakers, substations, generators, and the difficult choices of operating a strained grid in bad weather. The social disaster came later. The electrical disaster came first. And yet the two cannot be fully separated because the way a power system fails determines where people find themselves when the lights go out. If the failure happens during the day, people move differently. If it happens at 3 a.m, they are mostly at home. If it happens in cool weather, windows stay closed and tempers may stay lower. If it happens on a hot July night around 9:30, people are awake, outside, in transit, shopping, working, visiting, drinking, driving, and watching. Stores are still open, streets are still active, subways are still carrying passengers. The timing of the technical collapse set the stage for the human night that followed. Think about the power flowing through the city in those last minutes. It was not an abstract substance. It was keeping countless small worlds intact. In one apartment, it was holding a fan against a child's feverish sleep. In a grocery store, it was keeping meat cold in a display case. In a subway tunnel, it was pulling a train toward the next station. In a hospital, it was supporting machines, lights, elevators, communication, and routine. In a movie theatre, it was throwing moving images onto a screen. In a nightclub, it was feeding speakers, lights, and amplifiers. In a police station, it was keeping systems alive for a city that would soon need every working line of coordination it had. The grid was not lighting buildings. It was holding together the evening. By around 9:30, the system was close to losing that hold. Voltage conditions were unstable. Generation had been lost. Load had not been reduced enough in time. The remaining system could not carry the city as it had carried it an hour earlier. There are moments in mechanical failures when the outcome has not happened yet but has become nearly unavoidable. A glass tips past the angle where a hand can catch it. A car skids beyond the point where steering matters. A door latch gives way while the person behind it still believes it is holding. New York, in those minutes, was at that kind of angle, and still, inside the city, people were ordinary. A bartender might have been wiping the counter. A cashier might have been making change. A couple might have been arguing about whether to stay out or go home. A child might have been half asleep on a couch in front of a television. A doorman might have been opening the entrance to an apartment building. A taxi driver might have been leaning on the horn at an intersection. A police officer might have been thinking about the end of a shift. A firefighter might have been eating quickly, knowing another call could come at any time because another call always could. No one in those moments heard the grid groaning. They heard New York. That is a difference worth noticing. A city's systems can be in crisis before the city's people know it. We live inside consequences, not causes. Most of us meet a disaster only when it reaches our room. At 9:34 p.m. the consequences arrived. The exact experience depended on where a person was standing. In some places, the lights flickered first, giving that small warning that makes the heart lift and drop at the same time. In others, power simply vanished. The televisions went blank, air conditioners stopped, neon signs died, elevators froze, subway trains lost power, streetlights failed, traffic signals went dark. The hum of the city changed because so much of what we call silence is really the absence of machines we had stopped hearing. But before that final moment fully belongs to the next part of the story, I want to stay for one last breath with the machinery that failed, because there is a lesson here that is easy to miss if we hurry toward the drama of the streets. The 1977 blackout was not just a story about New York's anger, poverty, crime, and fear. It was also a story about dependence. A modern city can look invincible because it is huge, but its hugeness makes it dependent on systems too large for any ordinary person to understand completely. Most New Yorkers could not have explained Buchanan South, or 345,000-volt transmission, or automatic load shedding, or why one generator tripping could matter so much. They did not need to explain those things as long as they worked. But when they stopped working, ignorance did not protect anyone. That night exposed the distance between daily life and the infrastructure beneath it. People knew their streets. They knew their landlords, their bills, their subway lines, their favourite stores, their local dangers, their own routines. But they did not know the hidden chain connecting a thunderstorm outside the city to the light over their kitchen table. They did not know how many safeguards had to function correctly so that a child could sleep under a fan. They did not know how many decisions stood between a lightning strike and total darkness. And maybe that is true for all of us. We live surrounded by systems we trust without understanding, because understanding all of them would take more time than a life allows. The storm moved on, the grid did not recover, and New York, which had spent years trying to hold itself together through crisis after crisis, now had to face a different kind of test. Not a budget gap, not a headline, not a political argument, not a slow decline that people could explain over breakfast. A sudden darkness arriving in the middle of a hot night, entering every borough, every building, every subway tunnel, every store, every stairwell, every room where someone had just been living normally a second before. The power lines had failed. The breakers had opened. The great machines had protected themselves. The city had not been protected from what came next. And now, at street level, the technical story was over for most New Yorkers. They did not know about Buchanan South. They did not know which relay had acted or which line had tripped. They knew only that the lights were gone, the air was still, the traffic signals were dead, and the city outside the window sounded different. In the next minutes, millions of people would begin making decisions inside a darkness they had not chosen. Some would help, some would wait, some would panic, some would run toward opportunity, some would hide, some would do their jobs under conditions that had just become dangerous. The grid had failed in wires and control rooms, but the blackout was about to become human. At 9:34 p.m., New York stopped being a lit city with electrical trouble and became a dark city full of people trying to understand what the dark would allow. At 9:34 p.m., New York learned how loud darkness could be. Not at first, of course. At first there was the little break in the ordinary sound of the city, the tiny missing note that the body notices before the mind explains it. A television cut off in the middle of a sentence. A fan stopped pushing air across a bedroom. A refrigerator's hum disappeared behind a deli counter. A traffic light went black over an intersection where drivers had already been impatient. A subway train slowed, then stopped, and the people inside it waited for the motion to return because motion always returned. In apartment after apartment, people looked up at the same instant, not because they understood the grid had failed, not because they knew anything about Buchanan South or Indian Point or overloaded transmission lines, but because the room around them had changed shape. That is what happens when electric light disappears. The room does not merely become dark, it becomes unfamiliar. The chair you know is still there. but you do not trust its location as much. The hallway that you have walked through 1,000 times becomes a narrow question. The kitchen drawer where the matches are kept is suddenly full of objects your fingers cannot identify quickly enough. The faces of people you love become voices. The walls seem farther away and closer at the same time. And if you are inside a city as large as New York, the darkness outside the window does not feel like night. Night is normal. Night has street lamps, headlights, signs, windows, signals, and that great electric haze that hangs over the city even when you're trying to sleep. This was not night. This was the city losing the thing that made night manageable. For a few seconds there was disbelief. That short human pause belongs to every blackout, whether it happens in a farmhouse, a suburb, or a city of millions. People waited for the power to come back before they allowed themselves to react. A hand hovered near a light switch. Someone said, "What happened?" Someone else said, "Give it a second." A child asked if it was bedtime now. A man laughed because the timing was annoying. A woman cursed because she had something on the stove. In some rooms, people looked toward the television as if the picture might return if they stared hard enough. In others, they looked toward the window and realized, with a slow tightening in the chest, that the building across the street was dark too. Then came the second realization. It was not just the apartment, not just the floor, not just the block. Across most of New York City, the lights were gone. Imagine being in Manhattan at that moment, standing somewhere with a view down a long avenue. 1 second, the street is made of signals and signs. The red and green traffic lights stacked into the distance. The shop windows glowing. The restaurant fronts open. Headlights moving in lanes. Office windows shining high above the sidewalk. Then, almost all at once, the avenue loses its instructions. The traffic signals go black, and the cars do not stop being cars. They keep rolling forward with drivers inside them, each driver now responsible for reading the intentions of every other driver without the coloured lights that had been making those decisions feel civilized. Horns begin almost immediately, not because horns solve anything, but because a horn is what the hand does when the mind has no better tool. The city did not become silent. It changed instruments. The electric hum vanished and the human city rose into the space it left. Voices came out of windows, shouts moved down stairwells, car horns layered over one another, brakes squealed. Somewhere, glass broke, maybe by accident at first, maybe not. Sirens began to find their way through the dark. Dogs barked because people were behaving strangely. Radios that still had batteries became precious objects, small islands of explanation in rooms where explanation was badly needed. The blackout had taken away light, but it had not taken away fear, impatience, curiosity, anger, humour, or the New York habit of commenting loudly on whatever had just gone wrong. In Times Square, the effect must have been almost unbelievable. That part of New York had made a religion out of brightness. Signs, marquees, advertisements, theatre lights, movie posters, flashing bulbs, neon letters, the whole manufactured daylight of entertainment and commerce. Times Square was not supposed to be dark. Even people who disliked it understood that its purpose was to glow. When the power failed, the signs died into their own shapes. The words remained physically present, but without electricity they lost their command. A theatre marquee without light becomes just a structure. A billboard without illumination becomes a flat surface. A place designed to overwhelm the eye suddenly asks the eye to work harder. Inside theatres, the interruption arrived with a kind of theatrical cruelty. Audiences had paid to enter a controlled darkness, the pleasant kind, the kind that begins when the curtain rises or the screen lights up. That darkness has rules. You sit, you watch, you surrender to someone else's story. But when the power went out, the chosen darkness became real darkness. Projectors stopped, stage lights vanished, sound systems died. Actors and audience members found themselves together in the same uncertain room, no longer separated quite so cleanly by performance. Someone laughed, someone groaned. Ushers reached for flashlights if they had them. People waited for instruction. The city had interrupted the show with a much larger one. In restaurants, the blackout had another rhythm. The stove might still burn if it was gas, but the room was dark, the register dead, the refrigerators now beginning their slow betrayal. Diners looked at one another across tables they could no longer see clearly. Waiters tried to remember who had ordered what, who had paid, who had not, what could still be served, what had to be protected. In expensive places, candles appeared quickly, perhaps with a kind of forced elegance, as if everyone could pretend for an hour that this was atmosphere. In smaller places, especially where margins were thin, the owner's mind moved immediately to money. How long would the power stay out? What would spoil? Would the freezer hold? Would people leave without paying? Would the door be safe? A blackout turns food into a clock. Every minute without refrigeration begins to matter. In grocery stores and bodegas, owners understood this faster than almost anyone. The dark did not simply inconvenience them, it threatened their inventory, their income, and in some cases their physical safety. A small store after dark is a vulnerable place even with lights. Without lights, with streets filling and alarms failing, the doorway becomes a decision. Do you close immediately? Do you let the customers already inside finish? Do you stand at the entrance? Do you pull the gate? Can you pull it in time? Do you have family in the back? Do you have a weapon? Do you trust the crowd outside? A shopkeeper's relationship with darkness is different from a customer's. The customer thinks, how do I get home? The shopkeeper thinks, how do I keep this place from becoming nothing? Inside apartment buildings, the elevators stopped. This is one of those details that seems ordinary until you imagine it properly. An elevator is such a calm machine when it works. You step inside a small room, the doors close, and you trust that the box will lift you through a building as if gravity has agreed to be reasonable. But when the power fails, the elevator becomes a trap between floors. The light may go out or dim to emergency weakness. The air grows warm, the buttons no longer promise anything. You can press them, but pressing is now a ritual, not command. Someone calls out. Someone pounds on the door, someone tries to stay calm because panic in a small space spreads faster than heat. If there is an emergency phone, maybe it works, maybe it does not. If there are other people inside, their breathing becomes part of the room. If you are alone, the silence becomes worse. There were people in elevators all over the city that night. Office workers heading down after a late shift. Residents returning home with groceries. Hotel guests between lobby and room. Elderly people who could not easily take stairs and now had no stairs to take because they were suspended inside a dark shaft. Some were rescued quickly, others waited. And while they waited, the city outside moved into crisis without them. This is one of the strange humiliations of an infrastructure failure. It can reduce a grown adult with a full life, responsibilities, plans, opinions, and pride to someone sitting on the floor of a metal box, waiting for strangers to open the doors. In the subway, the experience was deeper and more frightening. A stalled train above ground is an inconvenience. A stalled train underground is a different kind of captivity. New York's subway was already hot in July, even when moving. The platforms carried the smell of metal, dust, brakes, old water, oil, and the bodies of thousands of people. The cars were crowded, people were tired, many were going home, and then the power died. Some trains stopped in stations, which was frightening enough but at least understandable. Doors could open, people could step onto platforms. The problem was getting out of the system, up dark stairs, through dark mezzanines, past turnstiles and gates that no longer seemed part of the normal order. But other trains stopped between stations, inside tunnels, surrounded by blackness and heat. Passengers sat at first because that is what passengers do. They wait for an announcement. They wait for the jolt of movement. They wait for the conductor's voice to make the problem official and therefore manageable. But announcements in a blackout are not always clear. Communication becomes patchy. The air grows heavier. The train becomes less like transportation and more like a sealed argument with time. Imagine sitting there. You are underground. You do not know exactly where. The lights inside the car may have failed or dimmed. Someone near you is angry. Someone else is frightened. Someone says this happened before. Someone says no, this is different. Someone asks if there is enough air, though of course there is air. But the question has now entered the car and cannot be taken back. The heat presses closer. People shift, sigh, fan themselves with newspapers, loosen collars, hold children, curse softly, pray under their breath, or pretend not to be afraid because pretending is sometimes the only form of courage available. Eventually, some passengers had to be guided out along the tracks, walking through the tunnels by flashlight, stepping carefully beside the rails, learning in the most physical way that the subway is not merely a route, but a hidden city under the city, and that it feels very different when the trains are dead. Hospitals face the blackout with a seriousness most people outside them could not see. A hospital is one of the few places where electricity is not convenience, not comfort, not background. It can be the boundary between life and death. Lights matter for surgery and treatment. Elevators matter for moving patients. Refrigeration matters for medicine and blood. Communication matters for emergency response. Machines matter because some bodies are depending on them minute by minute. Hospitals had emergency systems, but emergency systems are themselves machines, and machines can fail or prove insufficient. Staff moved quickly into procedures that most patients never think about until the ordinary world breaks. Generators started where they worked. Flashlights appeared. Nurses checked patients. Doctors continued tasks under worse conditions. Ambulances still arrived because illness and injury do not pause politely when the power grid collapses. There is something deeply moving about hospital work during a blackout. It is not glamorous in the cinematic sense. It is practical, tense, repetitive, and immediate. Someone has to carry. Someone has to hold a light. Someone has to find a chart. Someone has to keep a patient breathing. Someone has to decide which problem is most urgent when all problems feel urgent. Outside, the city may be turning into a headline, but inside a hospital room the story is smaller and more absolute. This person must survive the next minute. Then the next. In homes, the blackout forced people into old habits their grandparents might have recognised. Drawers opened. Matches were found. Candles were placed in saucers or jars. Flashlights were tested and slapped against palms when the batteries failed. People who had not thought seriously about darkness in years began rationing light in a small domestic way. Do not waste the flashlight. Do not open the refrigerator. Do not leave the candle near the curtain. Do not go into the hallway alone. Do not touch the stove. Do not worry your brother. Do not look out the window so much. These are not grand historical sentences, but they are the actual language of a night like that. Disaster enters the home as instructions. Children reacted in the way children often do, first with excitement if the adults seemed calm, then with fear when they sensed the adults were pretending. A blackout can become a game for a few minutes. Shadows on the wall, a candle at the table, everyone in one room, no television, no bedtime routine working as usual. But children are experts in reading the room beneath the words. They know when a parent's voice has tightened. They know when the answer, "it's fine," means the adult does not know. They listen to the street differently after that. They hear the horn, the shout, the braking sound, the siren. They ask whether the lights will come back soon, and the adult says yes, because what else can you say to a child in a dark apartment in a city that has just lost power? On the sidewalks, people gathered because staying inside felt too hot and too uncertain. The stoop became a living room. Fire escapes became balconies of speculation. Whole blocks leaned out into the night. This is one of the things blackouts do in cities. They bring private life outward. People who might have watched television alone now stood beside neighbours they barely knew. Men in undershirts sat on steps. Women held babies near open windows. Teenagers moved in groups, testing the mood of the street. Older people watched from chairs dragged outside. Someone had a battery radio and everyone nearby became dependent on it. Rumours spread. The power was out in the Bronx. No, all Manhattan. No, Brooklyn too. No, the whole city. It was lightning. It was sabotage. It was Con Ed. It would be back in 10 minutes. It would be out all night. No one wanted that last rumour to be true. Traffic became an immediate test of patience and mutual trust. At intersections without signals, drivers had to improvise order. Sometimes civilians stepped into the street and directed cars with hands and voices. Sometimes police officers arrived and restored a kind of rhythm. Sometimes drivers simply pushed forward, horn against horn, bumper against bumper, each person convinced that their own need to get through was the most urgent need in the city. Without traffic lights, an intersection reveals a great deal about people. Some take turns, some bully. Some hesitate so long they create danger. Some wave others through and rediscover for a second the pleasure of being useful. The bridges and major roads became complicated with confusion. Anyone driving when the blackout hit had to decide whether to keep going, pull over, head home, avoid certain areas, or trust that the city would sort itself out. Gas stations without power could not pump. Garages became difficult. Streetlights were gone. Road signs remained, but the world around them had changed. A city that depends on motion was still full of people trying to move, but the signals that organise motion had vanished. That is the thing about New York. Even when it stops, it does not really stop. Too many people are always in the middle of going somewhere. Not every part of the city was equally dark. Some places had emergency generators. Some complexes and institutions held onto patches of light, and those patches must have looked almost unreal against the surrounding blackout. A building with its own power became a kind of island. A lit window became a sign that someone somewhere had a different arrangement with the night. That unevenness mattered. Darkness, like money, was not distributed quite as simply as it seemed. Most of the city lost power, but the experience of that loss depended on where you were and what backups existed around you. At Shea Stadium, where a baseball game had been underway, the blackout created one of those strange public moments where thousands of people share confusion in a place built for shared attention. The lights failed, and the game could not continue in the ordinary way. The crowd had to be managed. People waited. The organ played. There is something almost tender and absurd about that image. Music continuing in a darkened ballpark while a city outside moved toward crisis. Baseball is already a game of pauses, but this pause belonged to something larger than weather or injury or argument. The city itself had interrupted the schedule. In bars, the blackout changed the evening according to the character of the room. Some bartenders kept serving by candlelight and flashlight, turning the outage into a story people would tell later. Some closed quickly. Some worried about cash, bottles, doors, and the growing uncertainty outside. In a city under stress, a bar can be refuge or risk. People drink to calm themselves, to celebrate the strangeness, to wait out trouble, or to become part of it. The same glass in the same hand can mean different things depending on the street outside. For police officers, the blackout immediately multiplied the city. Every dark intersection, every stalled elevator, every stuck train, every alarm failure, every crowd, every store, every frightened caller became part of the emergency landscape. The police department could not be everywhere, and people knew it. Officers had to choose where to go and how to respond while calls increased and visibility decreased. A city at night is already difficult to police. A city without lights, in the middle of heat, fear, and economic anger, is something else entirely. Radios mattered, flashlights mattered, vehicles mattered, judgment mattered. So did luck. Firefighters faced their own version of the night. Fires in a blackout are especially cruel because the darkness makes everything harder before the flames provide their own terrible light. Elevators cannot be trusted. Streets may be blocked. Hydrants may be opened by residents trying to cool off or affected by pressure issues. Buildings may be crowded, dark, and hard to search. People may be trapped or simply panicked. And as the night moved forward, the fires would multiply. For now, in the first minutes, the firehouses were still adjusting to what the city had become. But every firefighter understood something most people preferred not to think about. Darkness does not prevent fire. It hides it until the glow appears. Shop windows became the edge of another story. At first, many remained intact. People passed them, looked in, moved on. But in neighbourhoods where anger and opportunity met quickly, the blackout began changing the meaning of glass. A lit store window says watch, desire, maybe buy. A dark store window says something less stable. Behind it are goods. Around it is a street without ordinary surveillance. Above it, apartments full of people are trying to understand whether anyone is in control. Once one window breaks, the sound travels beyond the immediate act. It tells others that the barrier has failed. It tells the block that the night has changed. The first crash of glass is never only glass. But even then, even as the darker part of the blackout began to form, much of the city was still doing what ordinary people do in emergencies. Helping, waiting, adapting, complaining, laughing, watching, checking on family, finding candles, directing traffic, sharing news, carrying water, guiding strangers out of stuck places, keeping children close. The later memory of the 1977 blackout would be dominated by looting and fire, and those things were real, but they were not the whole city in the first hour. The whole city was far larger and more human than any single image could hold. There is something almost impossible to imagine now about the information silence of that night. Today, if a city loses power, millions of people still reach for phones. Even if cell service weakens, even if batteries drain, there is a reflexive expectation that information will arrive in the hand. In 1977, information travelled through radios, landlines where they worked, official announcements, neighbours, police, rumours, and the evidence of your own eyes. If you could not see beyond your block became your world. If the radio said the blackout was citywide, you had to imagine the scale. If you heard sirens, you had to imagine where they were going. If someone ran past shouting that stores were being looted, you had to decide whether that was news, rumour, warning, or invitation. The telephone system itself was overwhelmed by human need. People called relatives, police, fire departments, hospitals, friends, anyone who might know more than they did. A city without lights becomes a city trying to speak all at once. But communication systems are not infinite. Lines jam, calls fail, operators and emergency dispatchers become funnels for millions of anxieties. There is a desperate quality to wanting to reach someone in a blackout. You're not merely checking in, you're trying to stretch a thread across the dark. By 10 o'clock, the blackout was no longer an event that might pass unnoticed. It had entered memory while it was still happening. People were already forming the sentences they would use later. I was in the elevator, I was on the train, I was in the store, I was at Shea, I was on the roof, I was walking home, I was in the hospital, I was stuck on the bridge, I was putting the kids to bed, I was watching television when it cut out. That is how history lives at first, not as analysis but as location. Where were you when the lights went out? And if we ask that question gently now, across the distance of decades, we can see how many different New Yorks existed inside that single minute. The New York of the trapped passenger underground, the New York of the shopkeeper reaching for the gate, the New York of the nurse checking machines, the New York of the child delighted by candles, the New York of the elderly woman on the 15th floor realizing the elevator was gone, the New York of the police officer hearing the radio fill with calls, the New York of the teenager stepping into a street that suddenly felt wider, looser, less supervised, the New York of the driver at a dead intersection, the New York of the apartment window, the rooftop, the ballpark, the bar, the lobby, the stairwell. One blackout, Millions of rooms. That is why 9:34 p.m. matters. Not because the clock itself was magical. Not because every person looked at the time and understood they were crossing into history. It matters because it marks the instant when private routines were interrupted by a public failure. Before that minute, people were inside their own evenings. After it, whether they wanted to be or not, they were inside the same event. The darkness did not ask permission. It did not knock. It entered the city through wires and machines, but it arrived in kitchens, subway cars, hotel corridors, theatres, ballparks, hospital rooms and stores. It sat on staircases. It leaned over intersections. It pressed against windows. It made strangers visible by making everything else harder to see. It turned ordinary objects into tools or hazards. A candle became precious. A match became useful. A flashlight became authority. A locked gate became a question. A radio became a crowd. A staircase became a mountain. A subway tunnel became a corridor out of the underworld. And all the while, the city was listening to itself. That may be the most haunting part of those first minutes. When the electric layer disappeared, people heard the city underneath. The shouting, the sirens, the horns, the footsteps on stairs, the opening of windows, the calling of names, the crash in the distance that could be anything until you learned what it was. Modern light gives us confidence, but modern noise gives us cover. When certain machines stopped, other sounds became sharper. People could hear fear moving. They could hear excitement moving too. They could hear the difference between a neighbourhood waiting and a neighbourhood turning. The first hour did not yet contain the whole story, but it contained the shape of it. The technical failure had become a human test. The city's weaknesses, already present, were now easier to touch. Its strengths were also easier to see. Every person who held a door, shared a candle, guided traffic, calmed a child, checked on a neighbour, or kept working in the dark belonged to the same night as every person who broke a window or lit a fire. History has trouble holding both truths at once, but the city held them because it had no choice. As the minutes moved past 9:34 and the power did not return, the waiting changed. A short blackout can be treated as inconvenience. A longer one begins to alter behaviour. People stop expecting immediate restoration and start making plans. Store owners stop hoping and start defending or closing. Parents stop reassuring casually and begin conserving candles. Drivers stop assuming traffic will clear and begin choosing different routes. Police stop responding to isolated calls and begin facing patterns. Firefighters stop expecting an ordinary night and prepare for too many fires. Teenagers stop standing around and begin moving. Crowds gather, split, reform, and drift toward opportunity or rumour. The city begins to decide what kind of darkness this will be, and in many places the answer was still undecided. That is where we leave the first moment of the blackout, not as a completed scene, but as a door opening onto the long night. New York had gone dark. The shock had passed into understanding. The power was not coming back quickly. The rooms were hotter, the streets were louder, the elevators were stuck, the subways were wounded, the stores were vulnerable, the police radios were busier, the firehouses were listening, the people at the windows were still watching. The lights had gone out across New York, and the city was beginning to discover that darkness was not empty. It was full of choices, of... The first broken window did not sound like history. It sounded like glass. That is one of the things we forget when we look back at a night after it has become famous. We see the aerial photographs, the burned-out storefronts, the crowds in the street, the police lines, the newspaper numbers, the official reports, the totals that try to make sense of what happened. We say 1,600 stores damaged, more than 1,000 fires, thousands arrested, hundreds of police officers injured, and the numbers are so large that the night becomes almost abstract. But on the ground, at the beginning, it was probably one window, one metal gate rattling hard against its frame, one shout, one person looking over a shoulder to see who was watching. One crash that made everyone nearby understand that the darkness had changed. A citywide blackout is not automatically a riot. That is important to say clearly. Most people do not turn violent because the lights fail. Most people, even under stress, try to get home, find candles, check on family, protect children, help neighbours, direct traffic, and wait for someone official to explain what is happening. That was true in New York that night too. All across the city, people did ordinary decent things in the dark. They stood in intersections and waved cars through. They guided strangers out of subway stations. They carried groceries for older neighbours. They lit stairwells with flashlights. They shared batteries, matches, rumours, and water. A great many New Yorkers spent the blackout not breaking the city, but trying to hold their small corner of it together. But in some neighbourhoods, something else began moving through the streets. Not all at once, not everywhere, not because every person made the same decision, but because darkness loosened things that had already been under strain. The lights failed in a city where anger had been building for years. The power failed in neighbourhoods where people already felt abandoned. The alarms failed in streets where store windows displayed goods many residents could see but not afford. The traffic signals failed in a city where trust was already thin. And when the usual signs of order disappeared, some people looked at the darkened stores around them and saw not only property, not only law, but opportunity, revenge, hunger, thrill, and proof that no one was really in control. It is hard to describe the beginning of looting without making it sound too organised. In some places, it was organised. People used cars, chains, ropes, and tools. They knew how to pull a gate down. They knew what stores had appliances, records, liquor, clothing, furniture, shoes, or cash. But in other places, the first acts were chaotic, almost contagious. Someone hit a window, someone else went in. A person who might not have started anything saw others carrying things out and decided that the night had become permission. A crowd gathered around a storefront, not always as criminals at first, sometimes just as witnesses, because people gather where something is happening. Then the line between watching and joining became easier to cross. Picture a commercial strip in Brooklyn. The streetlights are out. The traffic signals are dead. The storefront gates are down. But the gates were built for ordinary nights, not for a city suddenly without light and overflowing with people who know police cannot be everywhere. A car backs toward a store. Someone ties a rope or chain to the metal grate. The engine revs. People shout directions. The tyres scrape against the street. The metal bends with a sound that is both mechanical and animal, a scream of resistance. The gate gives way. And then the glass behind it is exposed, weaker now, almost symbolic. A few minutes earlier the store had been closed. Now it's open to the night. The first people in move quickly. They are not shopping, they are grabbing. That is different. Shopping has comparison, hesitation, choice. Looting has speed. A television is lifted by two people who nearly drop it in the doorway. A stereo is carried against someone's chest. A box of shoes spills open on the sidewalk. Clothing comes out still on hangers. A cash register is torn loose and dragged. Someone laughs because the whole thing feels unreal. Someone yells because another person has taken what they wanted. Someone cuts a hand on glass and keeps going. The street becomes a marketplace without prices, without order, without ownership that anyone present is willing to enforce. And above those stores, there are families trying not to be seen. This is the part that matters. The streets were not empty stages where looters performed for cameras. They were neighbourhoods where people lived. Children stood at windows until parents pulled them back. Elderly residents listened from bedrooms. Mothers told sons not to go outside. Fathers stood in doorways wondering whether to protect the block, protect the family, or stay out of something too large to stop. Some shopkeepers lived above or behind their own stores. For them, the sound of looting was not a political symbol. It was the sound of their savings leaving through a broken window. It was the sound of years of work being carried down the block in strangers' hands. In Crown Heights, Entire stretches of stores were attacked and stripped. In Bushwick, the destruction became so severe that the neighbourhood entered the memory of the Blackout almost as a separate disaster inside the larger one. Broadway in Brooklyn, running along the border of Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant, became one of the most damaged corridors of the night. Stores were looted, gates torn away, fires started, blocks scarred in ways that would remain visible long after electricity returned. When people later said the city burned that night, they were not speaking only metaphorically. In some streets, the flames gave back the light the blackout had taken, but it was the wrong kind of light, orange and violent, climbing from windows and roofs, reflecting off smoke and broken glass. Fire changes a crowd. Looting can have noise, movement, and strange energy, but fire adds fear. Fire makes the night less private. A burning building announces itself to everyone. It pulls people to windows, roofs, sidewalks, and doorways. It creates its own weather, its own smell, its own urgency. Burning merchandise smells different from burning wood. Burning plastic, clothing, furniture, wiring, paint, and old walls fill the street with a chemical heaviness that gets into the throat. Smoke in darkness is confusing until the flames show where it comes from. Then the confusion becomes direction. People point. Someone says the building's on fire, someone else says there are people upstairs. Someone runs for a phone and remembers phones may not work or lines may be jammed. Someone looks for a fire alarm and finds it useless or unreachable. The city that already had too many emergencies now had fire multiplying inside the blackout. For firefighters, the night became brutal almost immediately. A normal fire call in New York could already be dangerous. A fire call during a blackout carried extra problems before the truck even arrived. Streets without signals were harder to move through. Crowds filled corners. Some roads were blocked by abandoned cars, traffic confusion, or people moving goods. Firefighters had to navigate through darkness towards smoke and flame, while the city around them refused to behave like a city with systems. When they reached a burning building, they faced stairwells without lights, elevators that could not be trusted, apartments full of residents who may or may not have known where the danger was, and sometimes crowds that were hostile, panicked, or simply too close. Think of the firehouse for a moment. The alarm comes in, then another, then another. The men move by training because training is what keeps a person useful when the night becomes unreasonable. Boots, coats, helmets, engines out into the dark. Sirens cut through streets that are already filled with horns and shouting. The fire truck's lights become one of the few official brightnesses in the neighbourhood. Red flashes on brick, smoke, faces, glass, metal gates hanging bent from storefronts. A firefighter steps down into a street where people are running in several directions at once. Someone is carrying a television. Someone else is pointing toward the flames. Someone is screaming that there are children inside. Someone is just watching. The firefighter has to ignore almost everything except the task in front of him, because fire does not care whether the city is having a crisis. Police officers faced a different, impossible arithmetic. There were too many calls, too many stores, too many crowds, too many intersections, too many dark corners, too many people moving at once. Officers could arrive at one scene and see several problems at the same time. A store being looted, a fight beginning, a fire starting, a shopkeeper yelling for help, a crowd swelling, a car trying to push through, a person injured on the sidewalk. In ordinary policing, the appearance of authority can sometimes be enough to stop people. On this night, in many places, authority appeared too small. A few officers standing before hundreds of people could not restore the normal meaning of a locked door simply by being present. This does not mean they did nothing. They made arrests, they formed lines, they chased people. They protected some stores. They tried to control crowds. They called for backup that might not arrive quickly. Some were hit by bottles, bricks, debris, or anything else available. Many were exhausted before the night was half over. Imagine wearing the uniform in that heat, moving under the weight of equipment, hearing the radio spit out emergencies faster than anyone can answer, knowing that every decision you make will disappoint someone. If you arrest this person, a store burns 2 blocks away. If you leave to answer a fire call, the crowd behind you breaks another window. If you stay, the radio keeps calling. The city becomes a map of unfinished responsibilities, and yet, to tell the story only from the police side would miss something. Many residents in the hardest hit neighbourhoods were afraid too. They wanted the looting stopped. They wanted their streets safe. They wanted the stores they depended on not to be destroyed. They wanted police protection, and also remembered years of conflict with police. They were caught between dangers, and that is one of the most painful positions a community can occupy. You can be angry at the city and still terrified when your block burns. You can understand the frustration that feeds disorder, and still know that disorder will hurt the people closest to it first. You can hate the conditions that made the night possible, and still grieve what happened in your own neighbourhood. This is why the Blackout refuses to become a simple morality tale if you look at it closely. There were criminals that night. There were opportunists. There were people who destroyed the livelihoods of others and set fires that could have killed families. There is no need to pretend otherwise, but there were also communities already damaged by years of policy, neglect, poverty, job loss, landlord abandonment, and official failure. There were young people who had grown up surrounded by boarded windows and burned buildings, and who had learned, from the city itself, that some places were not protected the same way others were. That does not excuse the violence. It explains the ground it grew from. The streets became strange theatres of desire. In one place, people carried out food because food was useful. In another, they carried furniture because a home with furniture feels like dignity. In another, people took records, speakers, turntables, and sound equipment, objects that mattered deeply in a city where music was becoming a way for young people to claim space and identity. There is a long-running story, sometimes repeated too neatly, that the looting of music equipment during the Blackout helped fuel the growth of hip-hop by suddenly putting turntables and mixers into the hands of people who could not otherwise afford them. Like many stories about culture, it is hard to separate truth from legend in a clean way. But the fact that the story exists tells us something real. People did not only take necessities. They took the tools of pleasure, status, sound, and possibility. They took things that said, "I want a life larger than the one I have been given." That is a dangerous sentence when it comes through a broken window, but it is still a human sentence. In some neighbourhoods, looting became almost industrial in its speed. Cars pulled up, trunks opened, people loaded goods, drove away, came back or sent others. Crowds moved from one store to the next. Some shops were stripped so thoroughly that by morning they looked less robbed than emptied by a moving crew with no intention of being careful. Shelves were torn down. Merchandise was scattered across sidewalks. Mannequins lay broken in the street. Shoes without mates littered corners. Boxes were ripped open and abandoned when something better appeared nearby. The disorder of the aftermath showed the difference between taking and acquiring. People did not merely remove goods. They tore through the whole structure of retail life, the displays, counters, records, glass, locks, and arrangements that had made the store a store. For store owners, morning would bring a terrible inventory, but the night itself was worse because they had to watch without knowing when it would stop. Some tried to stand guard, some were overwhelmed, some called relatives to help, some had weapons, some pleaded with people they knew by name. That detail is especially hard to sit with. In neighbourhood stores, the line between customer and looter was not always anonymous. A shopkeeper might recognise faces in the crowd, someone who had bought bread there, someone who had stood at the counter last week, someone whose mother came in regularly. Darkness can make strangers of neighbours very quickly. It can also reveal that the relationship had never been as secure as either side wanted to believe. The sirens did not stop. Police sirens. fire sirens, ambulance sirens. Each one meant urgency, but after a while the sound of urgency can become background, which is its own kind of horror. A siren at 9:45 startles. A siren at midnight blends with the next one and the next, until the whole city seems to be crying through machines. People at windows tracked them by sound because they could not see far. Is it coming here? Is it going away? Is that fire close? Is that smoke from our block or the next? Parents made decisions based on smell, heat, noise, and instinct. Stay inside, go downstairs, keep the children away from the window, fill the bathtub in case water becomes a problem, lock the door. Do not answer unless you know the voice. In apartment buildings near the unrest, hallways became tent spaces. Without lights, residents had to decide whether to leave doors open for air or closed for safety. Stairwells carried footsteps that could not be identified. The elevator was useless, so the stairs became the only route between home and street. In a calm blackout, a stairwell might become a place of neighbourly exchange. In a frightening one, it becomes a test of courage. Every sound rises. Every door opening matters. People listen for the difference between a neighbour, a stranger, a child, a drunk, a group running, a person carrying something heavy, or someone trying a lock. There were also moments of almost absurd contrast. A block could be full of looting while a family upstairs tried to finish a birthday cake by candlelight. A bar could keep serving drinks while smoke rose 3 streets away. A group of young men could be carrying a sofa down the sidewalk, while an old woman shouted at them from a window, as if scolding children for tracking mud into a hallway. New York has always had a gift for absurdity, even in disaster. The human mind notices the strange details because sometimes they're easier to hold than fear. Someone steals an entire living room set. Someone carries a mannequin under one arm. Someone runs with one shoe. Someone drops a television and curses not because of the crime, but because the thing broke before it could become useful. The night was violent, yes, but also chaotic in the ridiculous, messy, human way that cities become when too many people are improvising at once. But the fires were not ridiculous. The fires were grave. In Bushwick, flames consumed stores and buildings along Broadway and nearby blocks. The neighbourhood had already suffered years of decline, abandonment and arson, so the blackout did not introduce fire as a new language. It amplified a language the area already knew too well. Fire had been part of the South Bronx story too, part of the grim imagery that made outsiders speak of whole neighbourhoods as if they had simply destroyed themselves. But fires in those years often had complicated causes: landlord neglect, insurance incentives, city disinvestment, faulty systems, vandalism, desperation, and crime tangled together. During the blackout, arson joined looting in a way that made some streets look like battle zones by morning. But to call them battle zones can also hide the truth that these were lived-in places. People slept there. Children grew up there. Churches stood there. Grandmothers shopped there. Men came home tired from work there. The destruction did not happen to an abstraction called urban decay. It happened to neighbourhoods already carrying scars. At some point in the night, the city's jails and precinct houses began filling with people arrested in the chaos. The arrests would eventually become one of the largest mass arrest events in the city's history. But arresting thousands of people creates its own logistical crisis. Where do they go? How are they processed? Who records names? Who keeps order among the arrested? How do officers return to the street when paperwork and custody consume them? A criminal justice system is also an infrastructure, and like the electrical grid, it has limits. The blackout pushed on every system at once. The economy of the night was immediate and physical. Goods left stores and moved through streets, into cars, apartments, basements, hallways, and unknown networks. Some would be kept, some would be sold, some would be discarded, some were stolen simply because they could be. This is another uncomfortable truth. Not every act had a deep social meaning. Some people were angry, some were hungry, some wanted what they could not afford, some wanted to hurt the businesses they resented, some wanted status. Some wanted excitement, some followed friends, some acted because the night briefly removed consequences. Human motives rarely line up neatly for historians. They crowd together, just like people in a dark street. And in the middle of this, the radio became the city's nervous system for ordinary residents. People gathered around battery-powered sets and listened to reports that made the night seem both clearer and more frightening. The blackout was widespread. Fires were being reported. Looting was occurring. Officials urged calm. Mayor Abe Beam spoke to a city that could hear him only if it had batteries, access, and the willingness to believe official words in an unofficial night. Appeals for order floated over neighbourhoods where order had already become local, improvised and uneven. In some rooms, his voice may have comforted people. In others, it may have sounded distant, like a man speaking from a lit place into a dark one. There is something almost heartbreaking about official language during a crisis. It tries to hold the world together with phrases: stay calm, remain indoors, police are responding, power will be restored, do not panic. These phrases are necessary. Someone has to say them. But on the ground, people measure reality differently. They measure it by whether the stairwell is safe, whether the store below is burning, whether the siren is coming closer, whether the baby can sleep in the heat, whether the person they love has made it home, whether the street outside still feels like their street. As the night went on, the darkness became more than an absence of electricity. It became cover, threat, opportunity, and memory. People who lived through it would later describe not only what they saw but what they heard. The sirens, the smashing, the yelling, the engines, the radios, the footsteps running, the strange silence after a crowd moved on from one store to the next, the crackle of fire, the pop of glass, the heavy thud of something large hitting pavement, the voices from windows, the distant roar of a crowd that sounded closer than it was, or perhaps farther away than fear made it feel. This is why nights like this stay with people. They enter the senses. A person may forget the exact hour, the official explanation, the latest statistics, but they remember the smell of smoke in a hot apartment. They remember the candle flame shaking when someone opened a door. They remember looking down and seeing people run with boxes. They remember the way a mother's voice changed when she said to get away from the window. They remember the feeling that the city had become suddenly older, rougher, less protected, closer to some earlier version of human life where the dark belonged to whoever was willing to move through it. By the early hours of the morning, parts of New York had endured a night of emergency piled on emergency. Fires were still burning. Stores were still open to the street. Police were still making arrests. Firefighters were still answering calls. Hospitals were still working under strain. Families were still awake in overheated rooms. Some people had managed to sleep, but not deeply. It is hard to sleep when the city outside is making sounds you do not understand. It is hard to sleep when you know the lock on your door is only one small piece of metal between your family and a night that has stopped following its usual rules. And yet the city did not end. That may sound obvious, but to people inside the worst of it, obvious things were not obvious until morning. New York bent hard that night. It did not break completely. People kept working. People kept helping. People kept calling for help, responding to help, hiding from danger, moving through danger, causing danger, surviving danger. The blackout revealed terrible things, but it also revealed endurance. Not the polished kind cities put in slogans, but the plain kind. The kind that sits in a hot room with children until dawn. The kind that drives a fire truck towards smoke again. The kind that stands outside a damaged store and waits for morning because there is nothing else to do. What happened in the streets became the image of the 1977 blackout because images need action, and the streets gave the cameras action. Looting, fire, arrests, crowds, smoke, ruined stores. But the night was also happening behind the walls of the city, inside apartments, stairwells, subway cars, hospitals, elevators, kitchens, bedrooms and lobbies. While the streets burned in some neighbourhoods and crowds moved through others, millions of New Yorkers were having a quieter emergency, the kind without photographs. They were learning what it meant to live vertically without elevators, to sit in summer heat without fans, to navigate a hallway without light, to listen to unrest from behind a locked door, to comfort a child when the adult did not fully know what was happening either. The sirens, crowds, looting and fire made the blackout unforgettable. But the long night was not only outside, it pressed inward, it climbed stairs, it entered homes, it sat beside families in the dark and made every ordinary domestic object feel newly important. A candle, a radio, a bathtub full of water, a locked door, a neighbour's knock. A window opened just enough for air but not enough to feel exposed. The city's public crisis became private in thousands of rooms, and inside those rooms people waited for morning without knowing what morning would show them. Inside the apartments of New York, the blackout became smaller than the city, and somehow more frightening because of it. Outside there were sirens, crowds, broken windows, smoke, and streets that had stopped behaving normally. But inside, behind doors and up staircases and behind curtains, pulled halfway across open windows, the emergency became a series of very practical questions. Where are the matches? How many candles do we have? Is the flashlight working? Should we open the refrigerator? Should we fill the bathtub? Is the hallway safe? Has your brother come home yet? Did anyone hear from your mother? How long can a baby sleep in this heat? How many flights is it to the street? And if someone knocks, do we answer? That is one of the things disasters do. They take history, which later becomes large and public, and they reduce it in the moment to objects on a kitchen table. A candle, a radio, a glass of water, a set of keys, a damp towel, a phone that may or may not still connect, a window propped open with a book, a chair pushed against a door because no one is sure anymore what kind of night this will become. The 1977 blackout is remembered for looting and fire, and rightly so, because those events wounded the city and defined the headlines. But millions of New Yorkers spent that same night in apartments, not running through streets, not breaking windows, not appearing in photographs, but sitting in the dark and trying to get through the hours. Let us step into one of those apartments. It could be in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, or Staten Island. The details shift, but the feeling is familiar. It is July, and the heat has settled into the walls. The electricity has been gone long enough now that the first surprise has passed. The television is not coming back. The fan is not coming back. The air conditioner, if the family has one, is a silent wait in the window. The refrigerator stands in the kitchen like a locked box full of food that must not be disturbed. Someone has already said not to open it unless absolutely necessary, and everyone understands that absolutely necessary has suddenly become a stricter phrase than it was an hour ago. The room smells warmer. People smell warmer. The air no longer moves unless someone waves a newspaper or stands by the window and hopes for a breeze from the street. There is a candle on the table, and that candle changes the room. Modern electric light fills space evenly. It lets everyone pretend the whole apartment is available at once. Candlelight does not do that. Candlelight chooses. It shows the table, the hands, the edges of faces, maybe the cabinet, maybe the doorway. Beyond that, the apartment becomes uncertain. A hallway you have walked through half asleep for years now has a dark end. The bathroom has to be approached carefully. The bedroom doorway looks deeper than it should. If a child leaves a toy on the floor, that toy becomes a hazard. If someone moves too quickly, an elbow can knock the candle over. So the whole family begins moving with a caution that belongs to a much older kind of life. The blackout has not sent them back to the 1700s. Not really, but it has reminded them that the habits of modern comfort are thin when the power fails. The children ask questions first because children always do. Is school cancelled tomorrow? Will the lights come back soon? Why are people yelling outside? Can we go downstairs? Can we sleep in the living room? Why is that siren so close? The adults answer carefully. They do not want to lie, but they also know that complete honesty is not always useful to a frightened child at night. So they say we are fine. They say stay away from the window. They say it is just a blackout. They say the police are outside somewhere. They say no, do not go into the hall. They say lie down, try to sleep. And the child lies down with eyes still open, watching the candle throw the adult's shadow across the wall. Parents that night had to manage not only physical danger but emotional weather. A child can become excited by a blackout because it breaks routine. No television means everyone is in the same room. A candle feels special. The rules feel loose, but excitement can turn quickly. One loud crash from the street, one adult whispering too sharply, one smell of smoke, one sudden pounding of feet in the stairwell, and the game is over. Then the blackout becomes something else. The child understands that adults do not fully control the night, and that is a hard thing for a child to learn in real time. In tall apartment buildings, the blackout created its own geography. The lower floors were closer to the street and therefore closer to whatever was happening outside. The upper floors were safer in one way, but trapped in another. Without elevators, height became work, 10 flights. 12 flights, 15, 20. Anyone elderly, sick, pregnant, disabled, or carrying small children had to think carefully before going down, because going down meant coming back up. Even in buildings where there was no immediate danger, the loss of elevator service changed how people understood their own homes. An apartment high above the street could feel secure on an ordinary day. In a blackout, it could feel like a room at the top of a mountain. Some residents filled bathtubs with water, not because they knew exactly what would happen next, but because water is one of the first things people begin worrying about when systems fail. It is practical fear. If pumps stop, if pressure drops, if repairs take too long, water may become difficult. Fill the tub now. Fill pots, fill bottles, fill anything clean. The action itself gives the hands something to do, and in a crisis that matters. A person who is doing something useful can hold off panic a little longer. So across the city, in dark bathrooms lit by candles or flashlights, faucets ran while people listened to the street. The stairwells became the most important public rooms in many buildings. They were not designed for comfort. They were narrow, hard, echoing spaces, often smelling of dust, old paint, damp concrete, cigarettes, garbage, or worse, depending on the building. In daylight, a stairwell might simply be ugly. In darkness, it became a test. Every sound carried. Footsteps rose from below. A door opened on a landing. Someone whispered. Someone cursed after tripping. Someone carrying a flashlight became suddenly powerful because that small beam gave shape to the stairs. Neighbours met one another in ways they had not planned. A man going down for news. A woman coming up with a bag of ice that was already melting. Teenagers moving too fast. An older resident pausing every few steps, one hand on the rail, breathing hard. There were buildings where neighbours helped each other steadily through the night. People checked on elderly tenants. They knocked on doors and called names. They shared candles and matches. They watched children while a parent went downstairs. They carried water or food. They stood near entrances to make sure strangers did not wander in. In some places, this kind of cooperation was not sentimental. It was practical neighbourhood survival. People who had argued the week before over noise or garbage now needed one another. The blackout made the building a single organism for a while, and each apartment had to decide whether to stay separate or participate. But there were also buildings where fear kept doors shut. A knock in the dark did not always feel friendly. If the neighbourhood outside was loud, if stores nearby were being looted, if people had heard shouting in the stairwell, then even a neighbour's request for matches might be answered through a chain lock. This is another truth about crisis. It can create community, but it can also expose the places where community has already weakened. A hallway full of strangers is not automatically comforting simply because the lights are out. Trust has to exist before a disaster, or it has to be built very quickly under pressure. Underground, the long night was measured differently. Time in a stopped subway does not move like time in an apartment. In an apartment, you have your own objects around you. You can sit, stand, open a window, find water, talk to family, move from room to room. In a subway car trapped between stations, your world becomes a row of seats, poles, bodies, stale air, and the dark tunnel beyond the windows. The train is no longer a vehicle, it is a container. That change can happen in the mind within minutes. Passengers on stalled trains waited first because waiting is the habit the subway teaches. New Yorkers know delays. They know the announcement that something is being held because of traffic ahead, signal trouble, police activity, an investigation, a sick passenger, a train ahead. Waiting is annoying but familiar. But after the lights failed and the train did not move, the familiar delay changed. The heat grew. People began asking questions the conductor could not always answer. Children cried. Adults grew quiet or angry. The darkness outside the car windows made the train feel suspended in a place it was not meant to stay. Eventually, many passengers had to be led out. Try to imagine that walk. A person who entered the subway expecting to ride home now steps down from the car into the tunnel. The ground is uneven. The rails are near. The ceiling feels low. The air is hot and smells of metal, dust, oil, brakes, and old water. Flashlights move ahead. Someone tells everyone to stay together. Do not touch that. Watch your step. Keep moving. Help her down. Hold the child. The tunnel that had always been hidden behind the glass of a moving train is now under your feet. The city above is dark too, but at least above there is sky. Down here, there is only the line of people and the small beams of light. For the elderly, the sick, the very young, and the claustrophobic, that evacuation must have been terrifying. Even for people who kept calm, it would have left a memory in the body. The subway is one of New York's great acts of trust. Every day, millions go underground and allow a system they do not control to carry them through darkness at speed. On the night of the blackout, that trust was interrupted. The tunnels remained, the tracks remained, the stations remained, but the promise of movement had failed. Stations themselves became confusing spaces. A subway station without full power is not merely dim. It is stripped of its usual hierarchy. Signs are harder to read. Stairs feel longer. Token booths, turnstiles, platforms, exits, and passageways become less orderly. Crowds moving upward from trains met crowds trying to understand whether trains were running at all. Some people climbed stairs into neighbourhoods they did not know well, emerging into a dark city with no easy way to continue home. A person who normally transferred smoothly from one line to another now had to make street-level decisions. Walk, find a bus, look for a taxi, call someone, stay near the station. In a city without working signals, with rumours spreading and some streets growing dangerous, even the simple question of how to get home became heavy. Stores lived through the long night in several different ways. Some were broken open and emptied quickly. Some were guarded successfully. Some owners closed gates early and stood inside with family members, lights out, listening. A store at night is full of recognisable objects in the day and strange shapes after the power fails. Shelves become shadows. Counters become barriers. The register is useless except as a box of money that must be protected. Refrigerators and freezers are clocks, their contents slowly warming. The owner knows every aisle, every stack of goods, every weak point in the gate or door. That knowledge, usually a form of pride, becomes a list of worries. In a small grocery, the smell would begin changing as the night went on. Cold cases losing temperature, produce softening in the heat, meat and dairy becoming a financial threat, ice melting. The owner has to decide what can be saved and what cannot. If the neighbourhood is calm, maybe neighbours come to buy what they need by flashlight, and the owner writes down sales by hand. If the neighbourhood is not calm, every sound outside is a warning. A metal gate struck once makes the heart jump. A crowd nearby makes the owner move closer to the door or farther from it, depending on courage, desperation, and common sense. Some shopkeepers may have stood with bats, guns, tools, or nothing at all but their presence. A person guarding a store in a blackout is guarding more than merchandise. They are guarding the proof of years. There were also stores where employees were trapped by duty. Closing a place in a blackout is not always simple. Customers may still be inside. The owner may not be present. The cash must be counted or hidden. The door must be secured. The alarm may not work. The street outside may not feel safe enough to leave. Workers who had expected to go home at 10 might find themselves waiting behind a locked gate until dawn, listening to the city change around them. They were not heroes in the grand sense. They were clerks, cooks, stock boys, cashiers, managers, delivery men, people whose names rarely enter accounts of the blackout. But they were there, making small decisions under pressure, and the night asked more of them than their job descriptions ever had. In hotels, the blackout created a different kind of confusion. Guests away from home depend on a building more completely than residents do. They may not know the stairs. They may not know the neighbourhood. They may not have candles, radios, food, or local friends. A hotel lobby in a blackout becomes an information desk, shelter, complaint room, and emergency centre all at once. Guests ask whether the elevators will work. They ask whether it is safe outside. They ask if the phones work. They ask when power will return, as if the clerk behind the desk has a private agreement with the electrical grid. Staff members try to stay calm because the calm of staff is part of what guests believe they have paid for. But the staff are also people in a dark city, with families of their own somewhere beyond the lobby. In hospitals and nursing homes, the night had less room for uncertainty. Patients had to be cared for whether the city functioned or not. Emergency generators where they worked became lifelines. But even with backup power, a hospital during a blackout changes. Elevators may be limited. Non-essential lights may be off. Staff may be unable to leave because replacements cannot arrive. Families call for information. Ambulances keep coming. Heat becomes a problem. Communication becomes strained. Nurses and doctors are trained for emergencies, but training does not remove fatigue. The same person who had already worked a long shift now has to continue because the city outside has failed. Think of a nurse moving down a dim hallway with a flashlight or emergency light. She checks one patient, then another. She reassures someone who asks if everything's all right. She says yes, or close enough to yes, because the patient needs steadiness more than a full explanation. Somewhere a machine is on backup power. Somewhere a generator's sound becomes the most important sound in the building. Somewhere a family member waits in a chair and listens to staff footsteps. The blackout outside may be full of crowds and fires, but inside this room the work is simple and absolute. Keep people alive. Keep them calm. Keep going. The long night also belonged to people who were alone. A city of millions contains a great deal of loneliness, and a blackout can make that loneliness louder. An older woman in an apartment with no family nearby. A man in a furnished room listening to sirens without anyone to ask what is happening. A recent immigrant who does not understand the radio reports clearly and does not yet know which neighbours to trust. A night worker stranded far from home. A child waiting for a parent who has not returned. In ordinary light, loneliness can be hidden by routine. In darkness, routine breaks, and the silence around a person can feel much larger. Some people slept in clothes that night, shoes nearby, keys in reach. That is a detail that tells you the body did not fully trust the room. To sleep undressed is to believe the night will not demand sudden movement. To sleep with shoes near the bed is to admit that it might. Parents dozed in chairs. Children slept on floors because everyone wanted to be in the same room. Candles burned low and were blown out when adults feared fire more than darkness. Windows stayed open for air, but open windows carried sound. A siren entered. A shout entered. Smoke entered if the wind moved wrong. There was no way to close out the night completely. For people in public housing towers, the blackout could be especially difficult. Large buildings depended on elevators, hallway lighting, pumps, and common systems that made density livable. When those systems failed, the building's scale became a burden. Long corridors darkened, stairwells filled with heat and sound. Residents far above the ground faced the same question again and again: stay or descend? Public housing communities were often already dealing with neglect, underfunding, crime, and strained relationships with city authorities. The blackout did not create those problems, but it made them harder to manage. A hallway light that does not work in an already troubled building is not a small thing. It changes how safe a person feels walking to a neighbour's door. And then there were the people who were neither safely inside nor fully outside, caught in between places. Someone stuck at a friend's apartment because the subway was down. Someone unable to get back to the borough where their children were. Someone walking miles home in dress shoes after a late shift. Someone carrying packages that became heavier each block. Someone trying to cross a dark lobby, a dark parking lot, a dark platform, a dark street. The blackout turned the city into a series of thresholds. Doorways, stairwells, station exits, store gates, building lobbies, corners, roofs, bridges. Each threshold asked a question. Is it safer to pass through or stay where you are? Roofs became gathering places in some buildings. They offered air, a view, and information. From a rooftop, people could see where fires burned, where pockets of light remained, where sirens moved, where the skyline had vanished into a darker outline. The view was both beautiful and disturbing. New York without its lights was still New York, but it looked less certain of itself. People stood with neighbours, cigarettes glowing, radios playing low, voices carrying in the warm dark. From above, the city's crisis could seem almost quiet for moments. Then a fire would flare in the distance, or a cluster of sirens would turn a corner and the scale returned. There must have been countless small acts of kindness that no report counted. Someone giving a stranger a drink of water, someone guiding an older resident downstairs, someone letting a stranded co-worker sleep on a couch, someone sharing a battery radio in a lobby, someone watching a neighbour's children while she went to find her husband, someone standing guard at a building entrance for an hour longer than he wanted, because people inside needed to believe someone was watching. These acts do not erase the violence of the night, but they belong to the same history. A city is never only its worst behaviour, even on a night when its worst behaviour is highly visible. As the hours stretched toward morning, exhaustion changed the tone of the blackout. The first hour had shock in it. The next had movement, fear, opportunity, response. Later came waiting. Long waiting is different from crisis action. It dulls people. The candle burns lower. The radio repeats itself. The child finally sleeps. The adult remains awake because someone has to. The hallway becomes quieter, or perhaps only familiar in its noise. The refrigerator stays closed. The bathtub is full. The stairwell still smells of heat and concrete. The street outside has not returned to normal, but the body cannot stay at full alarm forever. People sit with their backs against walls. They talk less. They listen more. In the subway system, transit workers continued the difficult work of getting people out and stabilising what could be stabilised. In stores, owners watched what remained. In hospitals, staff worked through fatigue. In apartments, families waited for the sky to lighten because morning, even without power, would at least give back visibility. That is a basic human relief. Morning does not solve the problem, but it tells you where things are. It turns shapes back into objects. It lets you see whether the smoke is close, whether the gate is broken, whether the neighbour's door is open, whether the street is passable, whether the city you feared in the dark is still there. Near dawn, the city began to look less like an event and more like evidence. Broken glass on sidewalks, bent gates. Storefronts open like missing teeth. Burned buildings smoking. Cars abandoned or parked badly from the night's confusion. People sleeping where they had waited. Residents stepping carefully into halls. Shopkeepers arriving to see what had happened. Firefighters still working. Police still processing arrests. Parents making breakfast if they could, or pretending the morning had a routine even when it did not. Children waking and asking if the lights were back yet. For many New Yorkers, the answer was no, and that mattered. The blackout was not only one night. It continued into the next day for much of the city, and daylight brought a different kind of understanding. In darkness, fear fills the gaps. In daylight, damage fills them. People could now see what had been done. They could see which stores were gone, which blocks had burned, which windows were empty, which neighbours looked exhausted, which rumours had been true, which had been exaggerated, and which parts of the city had been hurt in ways that would not be repaired when electricity returned. But before that full morning reckoning, before officials walked through damage, before newspapers chose photographs, before politicians argued over causes, before the blackout became a symbol, there was this long private night inside the city's rooms and passageways. It was not as dramatic as flames on Broadway or crowds pouring through broken gates, but it was just as real. People waited in apartments without fans. They climbed stairwells by touch. They walked subway tunnels under guidance. They guarded stores in darkness. They worked in hospitals under emergency light. They held children, listened to radios, conserved food, watched doors, and measured time by the slow lowering of candle flames. The streets had shown what the blackout could release. The interiors showed what it required from ordinary people who simply had to endure it. And as the sky began to pale over New York, those two stories, the public disorder and the private waiting, started to meet in the open. Doors unlocked, stairs filled. People came down from apartments, out of hotels, up from subway exits, out from behind store gates, and into streets that no longer had the mercy of darkness to hide what had happened. Morning came to New York slowly, not because the sun was late, but because the city needed time to understand what daylight was showing it. Darkness had hidden some things, exaggerated others, turned rumour into shape and fear into sound. But morning is less forgiving. Morning puts edges back on objects. It lets you see the glass on the sidewalk, the metal gates twisted away from storefronts, the smoke still lifting from burned buildings, the shelves stripped bare, the shoes scattered without boxes, the mannequins lying in the street as if the city had thrown its own displays out into the open. Morning took the blackout out of the imagination and placed it under the plain light of day. For millions of people, the first thought was simple. Are the lights back? Not what does this mean for New York? Not how will history remember this? Not what does this reveal about poverty, infrastructure, policing, politics, race, class, or urban decline? Those questions would come later, in newspapers, reports, campaigns, documentaries, classrooms, and arguments that stretch for decades. In the first morning hours, people wanted the ordinary promises returned. Does the refrigerator work? Can I call someone? Is the elevator moving? Is the subway running? Can I get to work? Is the store open? Is the street safe? Did the food spoil? Did anyone get hurt? Has anyone seen my son? Has anyone seen my husband? Has anyone seen the owner of the shop downstairs? That is how a city recovers from a night like that, not all at once, not in one grand civic motion, but through small practical inspections. A mother opened the refrigerator and smelled the food before deciding what could still be saved. A man walked down 12 flights because the elevator still had not returned, one hand sliding along the railing, knees tired before the day had properly begun. A shopkeeper lifted what remained of a broken gate, and stepped into a store that no longer looked like his. A firefighter washed soot from his face and prepared for another call. A police officer stared at a line of arrested people and knew the paperwork alone would last longer than the blackout. A child woke on a living room floor and asked if school was still happening. Somewhere, a nurse who had worked through the night kept moving because patients did not stop needing care when the sun came up. The city was visible again, and visibility did not bring comfort everywhere. In neighbourhoods hit hardest by looting and fire, morning looked like punishment. Bushwick, Crown Heights, parts of Harlem, sections of the Bronx, streets in Brooklyn where store after store had been broken open, all carried the physical evidence of the night. The damage was not evenly distributed across New York, and that fact mattered immediately. Some neighbourhoods woke to inconvenience, spoiled food, tired residents, stalled transportation, and stories they would tell for years. Other neighbourhoods woke to blocks that had lost grocery stores, furniture stores, clothing shops, liquor stores, appliance stores, small businesses that had served people who now had fewer places to buy what they needed. A blackout had covered the city, but the scars it left were local. This is one of the hardest things to understand about disaster. The headline is citywide. The recovery is address by address. A store owner walking into a looted shop that morning did not see urban sociology. He saw missing shelves. He saw broken glass. He saw the register torn apart. He saw goods bought on credit, now gone before they could be sold. He saw invoices that still had to be paid, employees who might not be paid, insurance that might or might not cover the loss, and customers who might assume the store would reopen as if reopening were a matter of pride rather than money. If the store had burned, he saw something worse. Fire does not merely steal inventory. It removes the place where inventory could ever be kept. It takes the counter where hands rested, the doorbell sound, the little back room, the smell of cardboard and dust and merchandise, the marks on the wall, the old routines of opening and closing. It takes the proof that work had accumulated somewhere. For residents, the destruction had a different cruelty. Some people who had not looted, who had spent the night afraid behind locked doors, now came outside and found their own neighbourhood made poorer. That is what people far away often miss. When a commercial strip in a struggling neighbourhood is destroyed, the loss does not belong only to the owners. It belongs to everyone who depends on the stores, everyone who walked there for milk, medicine, shoes, fabric, groceries, records, furniture, or a conversation with someone who knew their name. A neighbourhood store is not only a business, it is part of the daily map of a life. When it is gone, the map becomes harder. And still, as always, New Yorkers talked. They talked on stoops, in lines, in lobbies, outside damaged stores, through apartment windows, beside hydrants, at bus stops, in the few places with working telephones, in police stations, firehouses, hospitals, newsrooms, and City Hall. New York does not suffer quietly. It narrates itself while suffering. People argued over what had happened before the ashes cooled. They blamed Con Edison. They blamed the city. They blamed poverty. They blamed criminals. They blamed politicians. They blamed the police for not being everywhere, and then blamed them for how they behaved where they were. They blamed the heat, the storm, the power grid, the blackout itself, the neighbourhoods, the newspapers, the banks, the budget cuts, the years of decline. And sometimes, with a tired shrug, they blame New York for being New York. Mayor Abraham Beame faced a city that wanted answers faster than any official investigation could provide. He had already spent his mayoralty under the shadow of fiscal crisis, accused by many of managing decline rather than reversing it. Now the blackout placed another burden on him. A mayor during a blackout must be practical and symbolic at the same time. He has to coordinate emergency response, speak to agencies, communicate with the public, and project authority when authority is precisely what the night has called into question. That is a difficult performance under any circumstance. In New York in 1977, it was almost impossible. Too many people already believed the city was slipping. The blackout seemed to confirm whatever they had feared. And this is where the event became larger than electricity. A blackout caused by technical failure turned quickly into a judgment on the condition of New York. The power grid had failed, yes, but what people saw afterward was not only a power grid. They saw looting, fire, arrests, and entire blocks damaged. They saw the city's inequality exposed by where the worst destruction had occurred. They saw the weakness of emergency systems when too many problems came at once. They saw a police force overwhelmed in places and forceful in others. They saw young people willing to tear open stores in their own neighbourhoods. They saw shopkeepers standing amid ruins. They saw residents who had done nothing wrong facing a poorer, more damaged street than the one they had lived on the day before. If 1965 had been remembered as the blackout that proved New Yorkers could behave well in the dark, 1977 became the blackout that suggested the dark had found something broken. That comparison haunted the city. People asked why the two nights had been so different. The answer was not that New Yorkers had somehow become a different species in 12 years. The answer was that the city around them had changed. The 1965 blackout struck a New York that still had more confidence in its institutions, more economic stability, and less visible abandonment. The 1977 blackout struck a New York after fiscal crisis, after layoffs, after years of rising crime, after manufacturing decline, after neighbourhoods had burned, after trust had thinned, after people had begun to wonder whether government could keep the basic promises of urban life. The blackout did not create that condition. It revealed it all at once. That is why the morning after felt so heavy. A storm can damage a city and leave people united against weather. A blackout like this left people arguing about themselves. The lightning had been external. The looting had not. The power lines had failed outside ordinary public view. The broken storefronts were right there in the street. People could understand a storm more easily than they could understand their own city turning on parts of itself. Even when they knew the reasons were complicated, even when they knew poverty and anger had history behind them, the images were painful. They made the crisis feel moral as much as technical. The arrests were staggering. Thousands of people were taken into custody, so many that the criminal justice system itself strained under the number. Precincts and holding areas filled. Courts had to process people on a scale that made the night feel less like ordinary crime and more like a mass civic rupture. The number itself became part of the story, repeated in newspapers and later histories as evidence of the scale of disorder. But every arrest was also a person, and every person belonged to a household, a block, a neighbourhood, a larger argument about what the city had become. Some were hardened criminals, some were teenagers, some had followed crowds, some had carried away things they could never have afforded. Some had taken advantage of chaos with no political thought at all. The law treated them through charges and processing. History has to hold the messier human picture. Damage estimates climbed into enormous figures, but money never fully measures the cost of a night like that. A city can put a price on broken windows, stolen goods, burned buildings, overtime, emergency response, insurance claims, repairs, and lost business. It cannot easily price the feeling of a neighbourhood waking up ashamed, frightened, angry, or exposed. It cannot price the memory of a child watching adults look afraid. It cannot price the shopkeeper who never reopens. It cannot price the elderly tenant who spends the next summer storm wondering if the lights will go again and what the street will become if they do. It cannot price the suspicion that enters a building when neighbours wonder who was outside and who stayed in. The blackout's official damage could be calculated. Its emotional damage moved less neatly. Power returned gradually. That is another detail worth remembering. A city of that size does not simply brighten at once like a stage. Restoration had to be done carefully, section by section, because bringing a grid back from collapse is itself dangerous work. Operators had to balance loads, restart equipment, reconnect areas, and avoid causing new failures. For residents, this meant hope arrived unevenly. One block lit up while another remained dark. A building across the street suddenly glowed, producing cheers and resentment at the same time. Someone saw lights return in the distance and felt relief before realizing their own apartment was still powerless. When electricity finally came back in a room, the reaction could be almost physical. The fan jerked alive. The refrigerator began to hum. A lamp snapped on too bright because someone had left the switch open. People cheered, sighed, cursed, laughed, or simply stared. There is a strange gratitude in the return of an ordinary hum. You do not know how loud a refrigerator is until it stops, and you do not know how reassuring it is until it starts again after a night like that. The sound means food might be saved. It means routine may be repaired. It means the house is connected again to the unseen system beyond the walls. The fan turning means sleep might be possible. A working elevator means height is no longer a trap. A traffic light changing colour means strangers in cars can trust a shared instruction again. Electricity is never only electricity in a modern city. It is confidence made audible. But confidence did not return as easily as power. The investigations that followed looked at the technical side as they had to. The grid had failed, and people needed to know why. Lightning strikes, disabled transmission lines, protective equipment, operator decisions, communication, load shedding, system design, Con Edison's response, and the need for better procedures all became part of the official story. Utilities learned from the failure. Systems were studied and changed, plans were revised. The language of engineering took the blackout apart piece by piece, because that is what engineering must do after disaster. It asks, where did the sequence begin? Which protections failed? Which decisions mattered? How do we prevent the same cascade from happening again? Those questions mattered. They still matter. A city cannot simply say the real problem was social anger and ignore the wires. The wires failed first. But the technical investigation could not explain why the same electrical failure became such a profound civic wound. For that, people had to look beyond the grid. What the blackout revealed was that New York's infrastructure was not only electrical, it was social. The city depended on trust just as much as it depended on transmission lines. Trust that stores would be protected, trust that police could respond, trust that neighbourhoods were not abandoned. Trust that poor residents still had a stake in the city's future. Trust that government could keep services running. Trust that rules were not only restraints on the powerless, but part of a shared bargain. On the night of the blackout, many of those forms of trust failed unevenly, visibly and painfully. It also revealed how close ordinary life was to disorder when systems were strained. This is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. Modern urban life can feel solid because it is repetitive. Every morning the train comes, even if late. Every night the streetlights glow, stores open, gates close, elevators move, police patrol, firehouses answer, water runs, food stays cold. But beneath that repetition are systems that must be maintained and relationships that must be believed in. When enough of them weaken, a single failure can travel farther than it should. For some outside observers, the blackout confirmed a cruel story they already wanted to tell about New York as ungovernable, dangerous, and doomed. They looked at the looting and fires and saw a city proving its worst reputation. For some residents of damaged neighbourhoods, the morning confirmed a different story, that the city would notice them mainly when something went wrong, that cameras would come for the burning blocks, but not for the years before the fire, that officials would condemn the destruction without fully answering why so many blocks had already looked abandoned before the blackout. Both reactions shaped the memory of the event. The blackout became a symbol because different people could load it with different meanings, and then politics moved on because politics always does. The mayoral campaign continued. Ed Koch would soon become the face of a new era in New York, one built around restoring confidence, order, and the feeling that the city could govern itself again. Whether one loved him or hated him, his rise belonged partly to the mood that the blackout had deepened. Many New Yorkers wanted someone who seemed tougher, sharper, more openly impatient with decline. The city wanted light back in more than the literal sense. It wanted a mayor who could make New York feel less helpless. That desire did not begin with the blackout, but the blackout made it harder to ignore. In the neighborhoods most damaged, recovery was slow. A store does not return because power returns. A burned building does not rebuild itself because the lights come on. Insurance claims take time. Money may not come. Owners may walk away. Residents may shop elsewhere because they must. Vacant lots may remain. A commercial strip can lose momentum in a single night and spend years trying to regain it. For communities already fighting abandonment, the blackout was not an isolated wound. It was another injury layered on old injuries, and yet people kept living there. That should never be treated as a small thing. The history of New York is not only the history of officials, police, utilities, banks, and disasters. It is also the history of residents who wake up after the disaster and sweep glass. People who reopen. People who board up a window and come back the next day. People who organise a block association. People who tell children not to confuse what happened last night with what the neighbourhood is. People who criticise the city and still refuse to leave it. People who make breakfast after a night without sleep. People who go to work because rent is still due even after history has passed through the street. There is a kind of resilience that gets used too easily in stories about cities. It can become a way to avoid talking about what people should never have had to endure. So let us be careful. New Yorkers were resilient after the 1977 blackout, but resilience was not a substitute for justice, investment, repairs, jobs, safety, or functioning infrastructure. The fact that people survived does not mean the conditions were acceptable. The fact that a neighbourhood endured does not mean the city had done right by it. The morning after should not make us admire suffering so much that we forget to ask why it was distributed the way it was. Still, there was something unmistakable about the city's survival. By the time power returned and the immediate crisis ended, New York had not been fixed, but it had continued. Trains would run again, stores would reopen where they could, garbage would be swept, courts would process cases, newspapers would print, politicians would speak, children would go back to school or summer routines. People would tell blackout stories for the rest of their lives, sometimes with fear, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a strange laugh at the absurdity of what they had seen. The city absorbed the night into itself, not because it was easy, but because cities are made of people who have to wake up the next morning. What did the blackout reveal about New York? It revealed a city dependent on systems most of its people could not see until those systems failed. It revealed neighbourhoods carrying anger that did not begin with the storm. It revealed the fragility of order when trust is thin. It revealed courage in firehouses, hospitals, stairwells, apartment buildings, and dark subway tunnels. It revealed cruelty, opportunism, fear, and neglect. It revealed that poverty is not quiet just because power is on. It revealed that abandonment can sit inside a city for years and then suddenly become visible in one night. It revealed that a skyline can be famous for light while whole communities feel unseen beneath it. And maybe most of all, it revealed that darkness is never only darkness in a city. It is a test of everything built before it arrives. That is why the night still holds our attention. Not because electricity failed. Electricity fails. Machines break. Storms strike. Human beings design systems imperfectly and then rely on them completely. What makes July 13th, 1977, so haunting is that the blackout turned the city inside out. It showed the wires under the street and the nerves under the culture. It made New York look at the condition of its own households, stores, stations, hospitals, police, politics, neighbourhoods, and promises. It forced the question no city wants to answer in public. What happens when the lights go out and people discover how much darkness was already there? By the following evening, much of the city was glowing again. Lamps burned in apartments, streetlights returned. Refrigerators hummed, elevators moved, television spoke. Neon signs lifted themselves back into the night. From a distance, New York may have looked restored, the skyline once again declaring that the city was alive and bright and impossible to defeat. But down at street level, where glass still crunched under shoes and smoke still clung to brick, people knew better. The lights had come back, yes, but the blackout had shown them something that could not simply be switched off again. It had shown them the city beneath the city, the fragile, angry, stubborn, wounded place that had been there all along, waiting under the glow.